Chapter 664. 10 li out of the capital, the group of carriages stopped for a moment. Yin Bingyun disembarked from the carriage and did not send them off. Watching Sir Yin Jr.'s disappearing figure, Fan Xian smiled warmly. He thought that since the council already had a handle on his own way, Jingdo should be fine. Fan Xian would not look down on his own way. He trusted the emperor's eyesight very much. He knew that his own way certainly had his abilities. However, in front of the Overwatch Council, the scholar's abilities often appeared to be insufficient. Thus, his attitude in dealing with this problem appeared to be relatively relaxed. As for whether or not this relaxation was a sufficiently correct attitude, that would depend on how things developed in the future. Mu Feng rode to the side of the carriage window and thought of the intelligence report he had just received. He felt surprised in his heart. As the temporary leader of the Qinian unit, he knew all of Sir Fan Jr.'s shady and private matters. However, the matter mentioned in this intelligence report was something that even he had never come into contact with. What exactly was it that made Sir Fan Jr. so cautious? Mu Feng swallowed and moistened his dry throat. Lowering his voice, he said, "A reply from Yuchong." Mu Feng had no idea what Yuchong referred to. During these 2 years, Sir Fan Jr. and Yuchong had exchanged 3 letters. Not only did these 3 letters go through the council's highest-level mail route, but the people who delivered the letters along the way were all core members of the Qinian unit. However, even these core members did not know who the letter had ended up in. Where was Yuchong? What did Yuchong refer to? Mu Feng had endless questions in his heart. Since the commissioner did not say, he could not guess. He did not dare to guess. Fan Xian was just about to put down the curtain on the carriage window. After hearing this news, he smiled and quietly said, "Where's the letter?" Mu Feng made a whistle. All of the Overwatch Council's secret agents and swordsmen beside the carriage spread out. They each controlled the surroundings of the road and the direction of the woodlands. They surrounded the black carriage in which Fan Xian was in. Fan Xian took the letter and glanced at it. He remembered the words clearly. The words on the letter were all very common, and the meaning put together was also very common. But only the writer and the receiver knew the true meaning. He suddenly felt an itch at the top of his ear. He couldn't help but scratch it. Closing his palm, he crushed the entire letter into a snowflake. This was a method he had long gotten used to. He had once seen it. The emperor seemed to have this habit as well. Perhaps those who had learned the tyrannical true qi all had too much true qi and used it as a human shredder. These rather absurd and cute thoughts suddenly appeared in Fan Xian's mind. A faint and quiet smile rose to his face. It was clear that he was in a good mood. Mu Feng didn't know why he was in a good mood and asked hesitantly, "Sir, should we continue along the same path?" "No." Fan Xian restrained his expression and said seriously, "Go to Dongyi on your own. I will meet you outside the city." Mu Feng was slightly startled and didn't dare to accept the order. The director had strict orders to not allow you to move alone again. "I am now the director." Fan Xian looked at him with a smile. Mu Feng was slightly embarrassed. Only now did he remember that before they left the capital, the emperor had already issued a decree to the world. Sir Fan Jr. had officially taken over Director Chen's position and became the 2nd director of the Overwatch Council of the Qin Kingdom. He was no longer the commissioner of the past. The black carriages gradually left. Fan Xian stood in the woods and looked at his loyal subordinates. He thought to himself that he was responsible for too many people's lives. Perhaps this was a very headache-inducing matter. South of Jingdo was Weizhou. The city by the Wei River was radiated by the splendor of Jingdo. It was also a place that high officials, nobles, and wealthy merchants had to pass through on their way to Jiangnan. Although the city was not large, it still appeared particularly prosperous. Wherever it was prosperous, there were bound to be brothels and gambling dens. Thus, Weizhou, without exception, had opened a Baiyue brothel. Far away from Baiyue brothel was Weizhou's largest and most extravagant gambling den, the 1,000 Gold Pavilion. Speaking of the 1,000 Gold Pavilion, it was easy for people to think of it as a brothel. Fan Xian, who was disguised as a merchant, raised his head, and looked at the 3 large words on the 1,000 gold pavilion signboard. He couldn't help but laugh. The gambling den had long since become a boiling cauldron of voices. Even though there was a large ventilation fan produced by the palace treasury that was constantly being used by the coolies, the smell of people mingled with the smell of perfume and alcohol. It was still a little unpleasant, and Fan Xian couldn't help but cover his nose. Looking around, he confirmed that the person he was looking for was definitely not waiting for him on the first floor, so he walked up to the second floor. Unexpectedly, at the entrance of the second floor, he was stopped by 2 people who seemed to be in charge of the building. Fan Xian was slightly surprised, but he immediately understood what had happened. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. With Fan Xian's status, of course, no one in this world would dare to stop him. He was used to this, so he walked directly up the stairs without any disguise. He didn't expect that today. He was just an ordinary merchant. The second floor of the 1,000 gold pavilion was the place where one could truly spend a lot of money. The people who came here to play were all wealthy and respectable. Even if there were occasional disputes, they all had a sense of propriety, so they had a good reputation. However, such a place always required a threshold, and Fan Xian's current appearance clearly did not allow him to cross that threshold. "Sir, if you're in a mood, why don't you stay downstairs and have some fun?" Although the steward did not give Fan Xian any face by stopping him at the entrance, his tone was still rather gentle. It could be seen that the management of the 1,000 gold pavilion was good. Fan Xian smiled and said, "I'm here to look for a friend." The steward was slightly surprised. After a moment's deliberation, he softly asked, "May I know the surname of the friend you are looking for? If there is an urgent matter, we can report it on your behalf." "My friend's surname is Guan." Hearing the word Guan, the steward's expression immediately changed. He immediately bowed slightly, but was extremely careful not to attract the attention of the gamblers on the first floor. He extended a hand and very respectfully led Fan Xian to the second floor, placing him in a very unique room. He then lowered his voice and said, "Sir, please wait a moment." Fan Xian sat in the room. It didn't take long before he heard the sound of hurried footsteps coming from outside. A charming young woman walked in with a slightly nervous expression. The steward also walked in with a young woman. He reported, "It is this, sir, who is looking for a friend with the surname Wan. Go out. You know what to do." The young woman bowed slightly to Fan Xian with extreme respect, then spoke to the steward. The steward made a sound of acknowledgement and pushed open the door. However, he still could not suppress the shock in his heart. There was actually someone in this world who could make Big Sister Guan so afraid. He wondered who this merchant-looking person was. There was only Fan Xian and the young woman left in the room. The young woman immediately began to bow again and knelt in front of Fan Xian. Very respectfully, she said, "Subordinate Guan Wumei greets the commissioner." Because she was missing an arm, Guan Wumei's kneeling was not steady. Because of the fear that had never faded in her heart, her voice trembled slightly. Fan Xian looked at her and sighed in his heart. One of this woman's arms had been cut off by his hand. No wonder she was so afraid of him. Nearly 5 years had passed since Fan Xian's first trip to Jiangnan. Xia Qifei had once again taken back the Ming family, and this cousin of Xia Qifei, a famous female bandit in Jiangnan, had successfully inherited the Jiangnan water bandits. With the powerful support of the new Ming family, in addition to the secret assistance of the Overwatch Council, Guan Wumei had established a high position on the Jianghu without much effort. It was still the same old saying. The Jianghu was only a part of the country. With Fan Xian behind Guan Wumei, even if he wanted her to be a gangster, what was so difficult about it? Stand up and talk. Fan Xian looked at her and did his best to say as gently as possible, "Right, there is one more thing. I have officially taken over the Overwatch Council. In the future, don't call me Commissioner." Guan Wumei was a peripheral member of the Overwatch Council. The edict in Jingdo had not yet been announced, so when she suddenly heard this news, she couldn't help but be shocked. In an instant, the shock in her eyes turned to joy. She had never held a grudge against Sir Fan Jr. in her heart, even if he had chopped off one of her arms. Sir Fan Jr. had avenged her cousin and taken back the Ming family. More importantly, she knew what kind of person she was. Holding a grudge against Sir Fan Jr., she had never even thought about it. So this joy came from the bottom of her heart. After all, to survive in Jiangnan, she had to rely on Fan Xian's position in court. In the past 2 years, she had heard that the Overwatch Council had been suppressed in Jingdou. The people of Jiangnan were also restless. Learning that Fan Xian had become the director of the Overwatch Council, Guan Wumei let out a big sigh of relief. Have the Lingnan Xiong family and Xuanzhou Sun family finally relented? Fan Xian straightforwardly asked about the purpose of his trip. During these 3 years, he had been secretly working on a secret project, hidden from everyone under heaven. However, this project wasted too much money. Although he controlled the palace treasury in his hands, it was, after all, the palace treasury belonged to the court. Most of the money from smuggling had been used to fund the disaster relief for the embankments that the court urgently needed. For a time, it was not convenient. Even Xia Qifei's Xia Mingji, which was now the new Ming family, secretly gave Fan Xian the greatest amount of support. Even his brother Fan Xizha, who was in the north, had sent large amounts of banknotes to the south under the northern Qi royal family's close surveillance. However, Fan Xian still felt that he lacked money. Would Sir Fan Jr. lack money to spend? If this got out, it would probably become a big joke. But this was true. It also meant that the project Fan Xian had been working on in secret these 3 years was a black hole that wasted countless amounts of silver. Guan Wumei had already stood and carefully glanced at Fan Xian. She and Xia Qifei both knew that Sir Fan Jr. had spent a lot of money these few years, but they still didn't know where all this money had been spent. Furthermore, it had been fine the first 2 years. Relying on Fan Xian's subordinates, they had barely been able to support it. However, a few days ago, they had suddenly received news that a large sum of silver was needed this year. It made it difficult for them to raise it. This sum of silver was too large. Even if Xia Qifei and Fan Xizha were given enough time, they probably wouldn't be able to raise it. The news came too late. We only had time to notify the Sun and Xiong families. Since we couldn't explain to them what exactly this sum of silver was used for, their masters were unwilling to relent. Guan Wumei replied, slightly nervously. The 2 leaders are currently in the Shazhou, not far from the Weizhou. Does my lord want to see them? There's no need. Fan Xian shook his head. This matter has to be done in secret. However, I'm afraid we won't be able to hide it for long if we have to ask the Sun and Xiong families to transfer silver. It's my fault for being too hasty. I still have to think about it. Guan Wumei let out a large breath. Truthfully speaking, even with Sir Fan Jr.'s help, it was still a difficult matter to secretly transfer so much silver away from the court's supervision. What scared Guan Wumei the most was that Sir Fan Jr. was spending so much silver and still hiding it from the court. Was he secretly organizing a private army in preparation for a rebellion? Otherwise, given Sir Fan Jr.'s present status, he would not do such a thing. Have Xia Qifei and the Sun and Xiong families tell them not to bring me out. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and said, just say that there's a problem with the smuggling route to the north. The northern Qi court suddenly acted and seized all of the goods. The Ming family needs to return silver to the palace treasury and also needs to have a flow of money out of their accounts. They don't have enough time, so they need a large sum of silver from these 2 families to support them. This was a good excuse. The only powers that could suddenly make the Jiangnan Ming family lose a large sum of silver were the courts in the north and south. Guan Wumei furrowed her brows and asked, however, the court has a lot of spies in the north. Even if the Overwatch Council's route can be hidden, there will always be other intelligence channels that will come back. There is no movement in northern Qi at all. She sighed with some distress. Unless we have the northern Qi court cooperate with us in putting on a show. After saying this, she couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly. The Qin kingdom and northern Qi had been enemies for a long time. Sir Fan Jr.'s close relationship with the north had been completely shattered because of the Battle of Shiliang last year. Additionally, everyone knew about the ownership of Dongyi. The northern Qi people hated Fan Xian to the bone. How could they cooperate with him in putting on a show? Good acting. Fan Xian said with a slight smile. I'll have the Northern Qi Emperor cooperate with me in putting on a good show. We'll hide it from the court and then give the Sun and Xiong families a convincing reason. What do you think? Guan Wumei was shocked. She felt that she could not see through Sir Fan Jr.'s depths. It was as if he was teasing her and said he wanted the Northern Qi Emperor to cooperate with him in putting on a show. I'm going to stay a night in Weizhou. The Sun and Xiong families came first. Entertain them. Fan Xian raised his teacup. Guan Wumei took her leave. However, the room did not remain quiet for long. A man dressed in black appeared in the corner of the room like a ghost. He carried an extremely long saber on his back. The saber was sheathed, and its murderous aura was restrained. However, the feeling it gave people was that it was abnormally dangerous. Fan Xian gently put down his teacup and raised his head to look at him. Why do you suddenly need so much silver? The black-clothed, knife-wielding man was still standing in the shadows in the corner. In a slightly raspy voice, he smiled and said, when construction reaches the later stages, money is always spent very quickly. These are the original words of the minister. Chapter 665. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He looked at the person in the shadows and hesitated for a moment before opening his mouth to ask, why are you so happy? Although we don't see each other often, I'm still not used to it. The knife man in the black shadow bowed slightly and said with a smile, I have always been such a frivolous person. Please forgive me, Sir Fan Jr. Frivolous? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, no wonder you caused such a big mess back then because of your playfulness. The palace named you to be eliminated. The bladesman's expression turned grave, and he said seriously, it is all thanks to Lord Minister that I am still alive today. Fan Xian didn't say anything more. Instead, he thought of other things, other people. In the Battle of Dong Mountain, over 100 tiger guards had all died. The emperor had used the sword in Sigu Jian's hand to cold-bloodedly and mercilessly purge the tiger guards. He had also swept away the greatest support Fan Jian had hidden within the royal family. It was precisely because of this attitude and resolve that Fan Jian had no choice but to retreat from the dangerous Jingdo early. Minister Fan had grown up with the emperor and had operated in court for many years. He had even secretly helped the Li royal family train the tiger guards for a long time. Naturally, he had some hidden cards. The black-clad bladesman before Fan Xian was one of them. This black-clothed knife man had once been a subordinate of the tiger guards. However, he later faked his death and became Fan Jian's direct subordinate in the darkness. He secretly did things for the Fan Manor that could not see the light of day, including monitoring the tentacles that extended out of the palace. During the Jingdo Rebellion, Fan Xian had taken a great risk to attack Qingyu Hall. Fan Jian had watched from behind with cold eyes and helped him clean up the mess. At that time, the ones who had acted were the secret forces of the Fan Manor, led by the black-clothed knife man. It was not until that day that Fan Xian truly came into contact with his father's last batch of power. You also know about what happened on Dong Mountain. Fan Xian looked at the bladesman and asked, how many tiger guards are still alive in this world? There are still 21 subordinates under the minister. The black-clothed bladesman said with a smile, if all the great grandmasters are dead, we will still be of some use. In the past, Fan Xian had only interacted with Gouda and the 7 wooden-faced tiger guards. For a moment, he was not used to the black-clothed, knife-wielding man's tone of speech. He smiled bitterly and said, let's not talk about this for now. Back to what happened earlier. Suddenly bringing up so much silver. Father, are you not worried that someone in court will guess something? The black-clothed swordsman didn't answer this question. Instead, he chuckled and asked, young master, you seem to have grown a lot bolder recently. When the minister sent the news, you really began to prepare to transfer money. You even didn't hesitate to reach out to the Sun family and the Xiong family. Aren't you afraid that the imperial court will notice something? The moment this was said, Fan Xian sank into silence. The black-clad bladesman did not continue asking. In the 3 years after the Jingdo Rebellion, the business Fan Xian secretly carried out in Yuchang had been done very carefully. He did not seek to be meritorious. Instead, he sought to be seamless. The progress was truly too slow. However, Fan Xian had no choice but to do this. Furthermore, his father, who was far away in Danzhou, seemed to agree with his caution. After all, with the emperor on the throne, no one dared to take the risk of stirring up trouble. If things got out, it would only be a scene of blood and fire. However, it seemed that Fan Xian and Fan Jian, father and son, had both begun to increase their pace. Fan Xian knew that his father had increased his pace because he knew that his heart was beginning to gradually drift in that direction. The black-clothed swordsman's next words confirmed Fan Xian's guess. If young master wants to do something in the future, don't forget about me, the black-clothed swordsman said with a smile. I'm also very interested in killing my way into the royal palace. The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. What I am interested in is, are you planning to avenge your family or those colleagues who died on Dong Mountain? Is there a difference? There is indeed no difference. For you and those tiger guards hiding in the dark, the emperor has never seen you as people. It is normal for you not to see him as a ruler. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and quietly said, but if you say this in front of me, are you not afraid that I will actually kill you? You should know the relationship between the emperor and me. The black-clothed swordsman calmly said, I know the relationship between you and the minister even better. Very contradictory. Fan Xian smiled and sighed. You're a group of powerful swordsmen, but you're also a group of dangerous people. Even I don't know if I can control you. Thus, I think it would be best for you to stay by father's side, including the dark tiger guards at your side. Don't try to get involved in my matters. A faint disappointment flashed through the black-clothed swordsman's eyes. Only father can control you, and I want to control everything in my own hands, so I can't use you. Fan Xian gradually withdrew his smile and calmly said, I have my own power. You only have one thing. You must ensure father's safety. As long as you can do this, and let me have no worries, perhaps I can achieve your and your brother's goal. The black-clothed swordsman fell silent. The silence lasted for a long time. Fan Xian took a sip of the cold tea at his side and unconsciously drew up his legs. Hugging his knees, he sat on a chair. His posture was not very beautiful, but it gave him a sense of security. It was in this instant that he thought of the second prince. Looking at the black-clothed swordsman in front of him, he also thought of Gouda and the innocent people who had bled and died because of the emperor's schemes. He even thought of Chun Pingping and Jingge, who had slit Qin Heng's throat in front of the royal palace in Jingdou. It had been a while since he had seen Jingge. A glimmer of light flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. He thought of how Chun Pingping had done so many things in secret and pulled back many people from the brink of death. His father had actually done similar things in secret these years. These two old comrades in arms had not communicated much, but they both chose the same method. They probably both knew that only people who had truly experienced life and death would have the courage to stand in this world and resist all the pressure placed on them. Only people who had survived life and death could stand bravely, even proudly, and ruthlessly under the light of imperial power. This was probably the problem of will that Sigu Jian spoke of. It had nothing to do with the level of one's cultivation. Only such people could truly do great things, such as the black-clothed swordsman in front of him and the silver-masked Jingge. Go back and talk. I will resolve the problem of silver as soon as possible. However, to turn the paper in the money house into the nutrients that fish intestines needs is a very difficult matter. Fan Xian looked at the black-clothed swordsman and said cautiously, I am worried that there are spies from the palace at my side. That is why I sought out Guan Wumei to be my shadow on this trip to Weizhou. If the internal court, the Ministry of Justice, or the Imperial Censorate find something, they will only suspect this much. You have to be careful and not be targeted. The problem is, young master, you came to see Guan Wumei to raise money for fish intestines. The black-clothed swordsman furrowed his brows. What if the other party investigates from this side? You and I are like the other side of a cliff, forever a one-way connection. Even if someone wants to investigate, at most, they will find me and not be able to investigate further. As for the direction of the flow of silver, The first part of the process in the accounts will be handled by the old officials of the Ministry of Revenue my father left in Jiangnan. As for the latter part of the conversion, Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. It seemed that he also felt this matter was difficult. Slowly, he said, I can handle a portion. Then, it would depend on how things are in Dongi. If there are goods coming in from overseas, it should be able to speed things up. Then, I will leave. Although the black-clothed swordsman felt that Fan Xian had not finished what he should have said, he knew he had to leave. Raising his hands in greeting, he said, However, during these 3 years, I have always been curious about something. Fan Xian raised his eyes to look at him and smiled. What is it? Why is it called fish intestines? After a long silence, Fan Xian said, Fish intestines is a sword used by a person called Zhuanzhu. It is a sword hidden in the belly of a fish. This sword may forever be hidden in the belly of the fish and never see the light of day. Once it breaks out of the belly, it will certainly pierce into someone's chest. You're a handful of fish intestines. Jingo was once a handful of fish intestines. The shadow beside me is also a handful of fish intestines, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. However, you are all beginning to see the light of day. Only my fish intestines are still hidden. Fan Xian stayed in Weizhou for a night and discussed the matter of gathering silver with Guan Wumei. Xia Qifei was in Suzhou and would not be able to rush over no matter what. He could only use Guan Wumei's mouth to remind the master of the new Ming family of the importance of this matter. The next day, the representatives sent out by the Lingnan Xiong family and Xuanzhou Sun family arrived in Weizhou. Fan Xian only watched from the shadows. After confirming the possible attitudes of these two giants, he relaxed. The new Ming family's excuse was indeed very practical. Although there was still no news from the north, the Sun and Xiong families would not believe that Xia Qifei would lie to them on this matter because there was no benefit to such a lie. When merchants lent money to each other, the key was still to consider the other party's ability to repay. In the eyes of the Sun and Xiong families, even if the northern Qi court began to vigorously attack the Ming family's smuggling to the north because of the Dongi matter, Sir Fan Jr. was still behind the Ming family. With the endless supply of goods from the palace treasury as a guarantee, it would always be a golden nest. No matter what, it was impossible for them to not be able to repay the money. After confirming that this sum of silver would arrive, Fan Xian secretly had Guan Wumei notify Xia Qifei to have him invite Yang Jimei to a banquet in Hua Garden. Presumably, the leading salt merchant in Jiangnan had a lot of silver hidden in his manor. It would not be too difficult for Xia Qifei to borrow silver from him. If Yang Jimei could not raise it by himself, he would mobilize the Jiangnan salt merchants to help. It had to be said that Fan Xian had endured in Jiangnan for 2 or 3 years and had indeed laid down a solid foundation. As long as he did not, on the surface, touch the foundation of the court, he had the ability to gather the power of the Jiangnan business world. This power was truly astonishing. To be able to raise so much silver in such a short time was not something anyone could do. These matters took up an entire day for Fan Xian. At dusk, he left Weizhou and disappeared into the color of blood. From that day onwards, not only did his subordinates in Jiangnan not know where he had gone, even his trusted aides in the Overwatch Council and Qinian unit had completely lost track of him. A young 9th-level ace who had immersed himself in the Overwatch Council for a lifetime purposely put on a disguise and went on the road. He had the ability to avoid everyone's gaze. Just like this, Fan Xian disappeared. After an indeterminable number of days, when the feeling of spring in the heart of the land had reached its peak, a travel-worn figure appeared outside a large call on the border between northern Qi and Dongi. This place was very remote, but the traffic was not behind because this was a transfer point on an old trade route many years ago. However, it had been abandoned for a long time and had long disappeared from the map. It had also disappeared from many people's hearts. Looking from the outside of the mountain, the place was quiet. Occasionally, there was the sound of dogs barking and chickens crying. There were farmers walking along the road. It was already late at night, but the occasional farmer that appeared did not seem to need a light to see the slightly wet and muddy fields beneath his feet. The figure quietly brushed past these farmers and headed into the mountain. The path toward the mountain seemed to twist and turn like a fish intestine winding back and forth. The travel-worn figure walked straight into the mountain. After walking for an indeterminable amount of time, his clothes dripped with dew and his cloth shoes broke dead branches. Finally, he climbed halfway up the mountain. What had been an overgrown mountain village in front of him turned his head and saw the flickering lights and manners all over the mountain. Countless buildings emanating a fresh smell appeared in the mountain valley like a miracle. The figure threw down the bamboo stick in his hand and looked at the lights in the belly of the mountain. For some reason, he felt very moved in his heart, to the point that his eyes were almost moist. He knew that this scene hidden behind the farm, hidden in the peach blossom spring, had used up a great deal of his energy and money. He didn't know how many people had paid for it. Chapter 666. Busyness, a cold, and a stomachache. These 3 mountains have tormented me for a few days. It is truly tiring. Sigh. In the deep spring of the 10th year of the Qin calendar, Fan Xian came to Tin Family Village for the first time in the secluded mountain village he called Fish Intestines. This mountain village appeared remote and peaceful, deep in the mountains. However, the lights in the night were dazzling. They outshone the multitude of stars in the sky and moved one's heart. There were certainly more than 10 families in Tin Family Village. On the road leading from the main road to the call in the mountains, there were far more than 10 farmers by the fields and springs. Those farmers were not true farmers. They were patrolmen used to block off the inside and outside of the mountains and protect the secrets in the mountains. Fan Xian was able to pass through these lines of defense and easily enter Tin Family Village because of these lines of defense and the particularly meticulous security arrangements. They had all been single-handedly made by him. The defense arrangements that gathered the wisdom of countless officials of the 2nd and 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council were indeed very powerful. When Fan Xian was making the plans, the officials of the Overwatch Council only knew bits and pieces. They had not thought that these blueprints would become reality on the outskirts of a small mountain village in the northeast of the land. Walking along the small mountain path, he had just passed a pond when he saw the densely packed and picturesque buildings revealing their true appearance under the starlight. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He stood there and sighed to himself. He thought that even if outsiders accidentally entered this place, they would probably only think it was a large manor built in the mountains by some wealthy family just by looking at the buildings outside. He stopped, and his figure was revealed under the starlight. Then, a dozen crossbow bolts poked out of the darkness and aimed at him. Fan Xian lowered his head and hid his appearance in the darkness. He then pulled up the hood on his back and covered his head. Only then did he take out a small token from his waist and flash it at the crossbow bolts full of murderous intent. A person who looked like a worker walked out of the darkness and carefully approached Fan Xian. He accepted the small token and looked at it carefully for a long time before he waved his hand and had the crossbow bolts disappear in the darkness behind him. The worker led the way, leading Fan Xian around the stone paths between the courtyards. They came to an isolated place. After confirming that no one was watching, he dropped to his knees and said excitedly, "Greetings, Commissioner." Fan Xian looked at him with a slight smile. This was one of the first members of the Qinian unit and an expert that Wang Qinian had helped him recruit back in the day. It had been 2 years since they had seen each other. It was clear that this secret agent had not expected Sir Fan Jr. to suddenly appear in Tin Family Village. It was difficult for him to suppress his excitement. "It's been hard on you these past few years." Fan Xian looked at the worker and said, "For now, don't leak the news of my arrival. First, take me to see the old shopkeepers." "Yes." The worker bowed respectfully and suddenly said, "The old master also came 2 days ago." Fan Xian was shocked and asked, "When did this happen?" 8 days ago." "Quick, take me to him." 2 dark figures walked through the buildings of Tin Family Village under the accompaniment of starlight. Fan Xian couldn't resist using his peripheral vision to size up these buildings that were different in height from normal residences. He looked at the specially designed doors, windows, and ventilation systems. He wondered if they were empty or already filled with things. Although everything in this village had been built bit by bit with the silver he had provided, it was still a very important matter. Thus, Fan Xian had cut himself off from everything here these 2 years. Even his most loyal subordinates in Jiangnan did not know that he had hidden such a village in a certain corner of the land. This was also Fan Xian's first time coming here personally. Other than feeling moved and sentimental, he also couldn't help but be curious. He wondered what those people, silver, and blueprints had changed the village in the 2 years after they were gathered together. The two of them walked into a small courtyard deep in the village. There was still a dim light in the room, making Fan Xian's shadow appear very thin and long as it fell on the stone steps. Fan Xian quietly said something to the secret agent of the Qinian unit. The secret agent smiled and left. He did not arrange for anyone to guard this place. If someone could actually enter deep into Tin Family Village and threaten Sir Fan Jr., then it would be unnecessary to send anyone else. Fan Xian tidied his clothes outside the room and walked in. Facing the stern-looking middle-aged man behind the desk, he knelt down on both knees and made a full bow. In a sincere voice, he said, "Greetings, Father." The retired Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, had not been in Danzhou to be filial to his mother and take Lady Lu on a trip to the sea. Instead, he had appeared in this small mountain village between Dongyi and northern Qi. This was truly an unexpected scene. Minister Fan looked at his son in front of him. Surprise flashed through his heart. Immediately, it became complicated. He smiled warmly and helped him up. The father and son had not seen each other for more than 2 years. They were worthy of Fan Xian's bow. However, the former minister knew that his son was not someone who liked to kneel to others. From this kneel, he vaguely sensed something. Fan Jian did not open his mouth to ask. Fan Xian also did not say that from his sister's mouth and the story of the past, he had already guessed what kind of painful price the Fan Manor had paid for his survival. "Father, why have you personally come?" Fan Xian helped his father sit properly in the chair. Looking at the faint white hair on his head, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Counting his years, his father should be in his hometown in retirement. However, because of Fan Xian's matters, these 2 years had still tired the old man out. His father's personal visit to Tin Family Village made him feel a glimmer of surprise. Fan Jian smiled slightly and said, "Although I am in Danzhou and can remotely control the construction of this place, after 3 years of accumulation, constant dripping wears away a rock. The preparatory work for Tin Family Village is pretty much done. If you truly have the courage to rebuild a palace treasury here, if I don't personally oversee it, I cannot be at ease no matter what." A second palace treasury? So, this remote Tin Family Village bore the weight of Fan Xian's great ambition. Ever since the Jingdou Rebellion, Fan Xian had secretly rescued a number of old Qingyu Hall shopkeepers from the capital. Additionally, he had been in charge of the palace treasury for a long time. A few years ago, he had made a copy of the palace treasury techniques in North Min additionally. With his present wealth and power, as well as the innate things in his transmigrated soul, if the heavens were truly willing to give him 10 years, perhaps he could actually turn this remote mountain village into a second palace treasury. What was the palace treasury? It was the foundation that supported the Qing kingdom's military strength for 30 years. It was an endless source that the Qing emperor used to supplement the national treasury and people's livelihood. It was not an exaggeration to say that the palace treasury was one of the 2 sources of the Qing kingdom's strength. The other was the emperor himself. However, Fan Xian wanted to rebuild a palace treasury outside of the Qing kingdom. Without question, this was the most important decision Fan Xian had made in his life. If this decision truly became a reality many years later, the entire world would change because of this matter. The Qing kingdom would no longer have the natural ability to smile proudly in the world. What exactly did Fan Xian want to do? Presently, the situation in the world was complicated. Furthermore, this matter was a major matter that could shake the foundation of the Qing kingdom. Thus, during these 2 years, Fan Jian and Fan Xian had worked in great secrecy. Progress had been slow. They only hoped to not draw the attention of the people under heaven and did not ask for speed. If, in the future, a second palace treasury truly appeared outside the Qing kingdom's borders, it went without saying what kind of powerful blow and damage it would bring to the Qing kingdom's national strength. Thus, Fan Xian hid this matter from everyone under heaven. He only dared to carefully discuss it with his father in secret. If you leave Danzhou for too long, I'm afraid it will cause discussion. Fan Xian was not in a hurry to discuss the problem of a second palace treasury with his father. Instead, he spoke with slight worry. Although Fan Jian had retired, seeing how the emperor had used a sword to kill people and slaughtered over 100 tiger guards, the emperor did not trust this trusted companion he had grown up with. Presumably, there were many spies from the palace stationed in Danzhou. If Fan Jian was not willing to retire in Danzhou, the news of him leaving Danzhou should immediately be sent back to Jingdou. Your Overwatch Council combed through Danzhou, and my people combed through it again. Fan Jian gazed at his son and smiled warmly. The emperor does indeed appear to be undefeatable, but he is not a god. His energy is limited. It is impossible for him to grasp all the minute changes under heaven, particularly since you are secretly hiding it from him. As for me leaving Danzhou, it was originally to wander around Dongyi. The smile of the previous minister appeared slightly amused. Before I entered the Ministry of Revenue, I was a famous wastrel in Jingdou. Now that I have retired and returned to my hometown, it is natural for me to go to a prosperous place like Dongyi to paint some beauties. The emperor cannot fly into a rage because of this. It's still not appropriate. I've just come occasionally to take a look and keep an eye on the progress. Fan Xian looked at his father. Other than worry, there was also an additional sense of guilt. He had never wanted his father and Chen Pingping to be involved in this incomparably dangerous matter. However, when it came to the matter of Tin Family Village, at the beginning, he had no clue at all. How could they rebuild a palace treasury from nothing? He was not his mother, Yi Qingmei, although he had a ready-made old shopkeeper of the Yi family, who had once experienced the construction of the palace treasury in North Min, had a large pile of records of the various processes of the palace treasury, and was even familiar with the layout of the 3 workshops of the palace treasury in North Min. He still felt lost and retreated when it came to building a new palace treasury. The night before Minister Fan left Jingdou, he talked with him for an entire night and cleared up many of his doubts. When Minister Fan discovered that his son was using the eldest princess rebellion to prepare to rescue the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall in Jingdou, he knew what Fan Xian was thinking in his heart. Thus, he spoke openly and honestly to his son. Building another palace treasury is more difficult than you imagine. This is an inauspicious matter that will shake the Qing kingdom and change the situation of the entire world. That night, Minister Fan said to him with sincere and heartfelt words, "I am a person of the Qing kingdom. Of course, I do not want you to do this. If you can convince me, you can leave the beginning matters to me." At that time, Fan Xian did not want to completely break off relations with the Qing emperor. He also did not want to become a sinner of the Qing kingdom and put the Qing kingdom he had grown up in into great danger. However, he still unconsciously began to dig up the foundations of the Qing kingdom. He only used 2 sentences to convince Fan Xian. This is not the palace treasury. This is what Mother left for this world. If Mother was still alive, she would not want the emperor to use her legacy to satisfy his personal ambitions. But your mother also hoped for the world to be unified. I don't understand those very mysterious things, but I understand women, Fan Xian said to his father in that quiet night. That quiet night, Fan Xian said very seriously to his father, "I only know that if Mother was alive, she would not want the wealth she left behind to forever be held in the hands of the man who murdered her." Minister Fan was silent for a long time that night. He then nodded. With this nod, 2 years passed. The father and son, who had the most money in their hands, began to secretly do something that was destined to shock the world. Perhaps what the 2 of them had done was too inconceivable, so not a single force had found out about it. This was also the result of Fan Xian's extreme caution. During these 2 years, other than the secret flow of money, he did not use any of the power at hand to help Tin Family Village grow. This little village was like a child who had been released into the wild, slowly growing among the green grass of the mountain. As for whether he would continue to release the sheep after he grew up or be released into the wild, that was a matter for many years in the future. Fan Xian did not ask him what Fan Xian would use Tin Family Village for if, many years from now, 2 palace treasuries truly appeared in this world. Fan Xian also did not ask his father why, as a subject of the Qing kingdom, he would make such a choice just because of the grudge between his mother and the emperor. The old shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, who had escaped from Jingdou, came to Tin Family Village. The craftsmanship secrets Fan Xian had stolen from the palace treasury came to Tin Family Village. Minister Fan's most secretive power also came to Tin Family Village. The silver Fan Xian had gathered from all over the world also came to Tin Family Village and the depression deep in the mountains. Secrets, money, and martial power fermented in this obscure little place for 2 years. No matter how careful the Fan father and son were, Tin Family Village was already prepared to expand. They had completed all the basic construction and were ready to become a second palace treasury. Thus, Minister Fan had the black-clothed knife man bring a message to Fan Xian that a large sum of silver was needed. This point of time was actually much earlier than Fan Xian had originally predicted. From the beginning of the plan, he had never thought that he could be mentioned in the same breath as his mother, Yi Qingmei. Yi Qingmei had not taken many years to build the palace treasury because she had the support of the entire Qing royal family and Uncle Wu Zhu to protect her. Furthermore, her abilities had always far surpassed Fan Xian's. Minister Fan clearly saw Fan Xian's confusion. He smiled warmly and said, "Those old fellows of Qingyu Hall were all old people who had participated in the building of the palace treasury. This is the second time, so it should be easier." Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. "But it's still faster than I thought. When we were repairing the palace treasury." Minister Fan seemed to think of many years ago in the wastelands of North Min. He smiled. "Your mother was actually impatient and didn't want to deal with these details. Lao Wu was someone who wouldn't open his mouth even once a year. Thus, I did all of these small and mundane tasks." So, he was the supervisor of the building of the palace treasury. No wonder Tin Family Village had developed so quickly. Fan Xian looked at his father and involuntarily felt a sense of admiration. He thought to himself that there was indeed a reason why the emperor was so afraid of his father and was willing to lose 100 tiger guards to wipe clean his father's power in the capital. Furthermore, Tin Family Village's location is good. You've never been here before, so I didn't have the opportunity to tell you. Minister Fan continued to smile, but the red streaks in his eyes revealed his exhaustion. After all, he was getting on in years. Regardless of whether it was in Danzhou or here, this former Minister of Revenue had single-handedly taken care of such important matters. His mind was exhausted. Fan Xian spread out a large map on the table. It was flat. Fan Xian moved closer and used the dim light to look at the markings on the map. Because of the markings, he easily found the tiny Tin Family Village in the middle and east of the map. His eyes gradually lit up. The geographical location of Tin Family Village was indeed, as his father had said. It was miraculous. If in the future they could open the road to the southeast and directly reach the shores of the East Sea, it would be easy to reach Dongyi. If Tin Family Village remained quiet, the people outside would have no idea what was happening inside. If we act immediately, there will be a large amount of supplies entering. It will no longer be like the ants moving around the past 2 years. It will certainly draw the attention of many people. Even if your silver is in your account, don't think twice about whether or not to act. Fan Xian saw the faint excitement in Fan Xian's heart and reminded him with a smile. Fan Xian's smile immediately became bitter. If he truly wanted to turn Tin Family Village into the palace treasury of North Min, hiring was one reason. Large amounts of supplies entering was another. The simple blast furnace and steel installation could not be hidden from the eyes of an idiot. Everyone would probably guess what was going on inside. Given the importance of the palace treasury to the Qin kingdom, as long as the court discovered the slightest abnormality, the emperor would not hesitate to send troops to the north and attack Dongyi at all costs, destroying the embryonic form of the new palace treasury in Ten Family Village. Of course, even if the emperor sends troops to attack, the location of Ten Family Village is special. It is easy to ask for reinforcements. It will not be easy to attack. Fan Xian's thinking manner was not like that of a Qing official. He was more like a traitor. Coldly, he said, Ten Family Village was originally the Yi family village. Most of your mother's subordinates came from this village. In order to protect the secret of this place, the Yi family village changed its name and became the Ten Family Village of today. And this village was the first place your mother chose when she built the palace treasury. However, for some other reason, she relocated the location of the palace treasury within the Qin kingdom to North Min, which is very close to Chuanzhou. We chose Ten Family Village anew because we believe in your mother's foresight. Fan Jian looked at Fan Xian calmly and said, other than your mother and Lao Wu, only I knew of this position. It is easy to defend and difficult to attack. More importantly, this is a place that none of the three powers in the world can fully devote themselves to. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, I would rather be careful and slow than let the emperor discover any clues. Your mother is no longer here. Although we have many natural advantages in our hands, it is impossible to build a palace treasury in Ten Family Village out of thin air without a number of years of effort and the power of a country. Fan Xian closed his eyes slightly. You had the intention to move the palace treasury out of the Qin kingdom to use this as a pretense to threaten the emperor. It was necessary to be cautious at the beginning. Fan Xian was not surprised that his father had so easily seen through his thoughts. In a quiet voice, he said, even if it is a pretense, it has to be real. Furthermore, who knows what will happen many years later? After all, the emperor is not a god. There will come a day when he will die. Thus, the moment you agreed to move a large amount of silver into Ten Family Village, I began to have doubts. Fan Xian opened his eyes and sighed heavily. Do you think the emperor will actually act against Chun Pingping? Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, I don't know. Fan Xian's gaze pressed on him coldly. What if the emperor actually moves? Fan Xian was silent and didn't answer the question. He only thought of the Ten Family Village that his cloth shoes had stepped on. This village was still very quiet now, but in the future, it would certainly be incomparably dazzling. Regardless of how the internal affairs of the Qin court developed, or whether or not there would be a great battle, Fan Xian always maintained one attitude in his heart. The palace treasury was not the palace treasury. It had come from a distant world and should benefit the people of the present. It could not become the logistics department of a vast army. Presumably, Yi Qingmei also thought this way. A certain person had killed her, and her things still had to help him fight for the world. If Yi Qingmei knew of this, her heart would certainly hurt. Fan Xian felt great pity for the mother he had never met. The more he felt pity for her, the more he didn't want her heart to hurt. Chapter 667. In a quiet little courtyard, a quiet person, and a quiet chest, there was a similar amount of pain. Minister Fan carried a glimmer of pity and warmth as he looked at his son, who had his head lowered and was speechless. After a moment of silence, he quietly asked, Let's not talk about Chun Pingping. I only want to ask you, from the moment you decided to personally step into Ten Family Village, presumably you already knew about the matter from many years ago. Regarding that matter, how are you going to deal with it? Fan Xian did not reply. Instead, he asked, When did you think of it? Probably after the Jingdo rebellion. Fan Jian's expression was calm. As he said in a gentle voice, Even if I wanted to, I didn't want to think about it in that direction. In the end, the emperor is the emperor, and I am his official. I started thinking in that direction a long time ago, Fan Xian said bitterly. At that time, I'd already guessed my past, but I didn't have a shred of good feelings toward the Emperor. So, when I thought in that direction, I could accept it emotionally. But he let out a slow breath and said in a slightly raspy voice, "Later, the Emperor treated me better and better. I was less and less willing to think in that direction, even though I knew long ago that other than him, no one in this world could banish Yi Ching Mei from this world. But I didn't want to think in that direction." Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. For the first time, I felt confused. In the past, I had once told you that I would not allow anyone to control me. My will was strong enough and would never be disturbed by external things. However, on this matter, I was truly beginning to feel confused. He raised his head and glanced at his father helplessly. "If you were in my position, what would you do?" Concerning this question, Fan Xian had actually thought about it clearly on the banks of the Lujing River in Jingdou by the side of the grave. However, Fan Jian should have the power and right to speak on this matter. Thus, Fan Xian had come to Tin Family Village, to Qing Kingdom's fish intestine, and quietly listened to his father's instructions. Fan Jian was silent for a long time. He then looked at him and asked, "You have to ask your heart how you really think of the Emperor. That depends on how he thinks of me." Fan Xian followed these words very quickly. Presumably, he had asked himself countless times over the countless nights. "What does he think of you?" Fan Jian warmly smiled and said, "You don't have to worry about my attitude. After all, he and I grew up together. Although I feel disappointed and resentful towards him, to be honest, I can't bring myself to hate him too much." Fan Xian smiled helplessly and then sank into deep thought. Concerning this matter, he had thought about it many, many times. Before the Jingdou Rebellion, the Emperor probably felt 30% guilty toward Fan Xian, 30% valued him, and 40% used him. After so many people had died in the palace, the Emperor's personality had clearly changed a great deal. Starting from a spring, when he entered the capital in the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian had to admit that perhaps the Emperor was a harsh and merciless person. However, when it came to how he treated him, there was indeed an anomaly. Even if he had been used in the past, it was an acceptable use. If the Emperor still had a sliver of true affection for the people of this world, then that sliver would fall on Fan Xian's head. The Emperor treated Fan Xian better than the Crown Prince and the Second Prince, much less that pitiful woman who had given up her youth and reputation for the Emperor. Quietly listening to Fan Xian's words, Fan Jian gently stroked the beard on his chin and sighed. It is easy to change mountains and rivers, but it is difficult to change a person's nature. Even though the Emperor's personality has become much warmer, in the end, he is still a ruler who thinks of the world as his own. Speaking of which, how you treat the Emperor depends on how the Emperor treats you. However, how the Emperor treats you depends on how you treat him. He looked at his young son and said with slight worry, "The Emperor treats you differently because ever since you entered the capital, you have always displayed unwavering loyalty. This is also something I admire about you. You are young, yet you know how to guess what you have guessed and cover up all the conflicts in your heart. You even hid it from the Emperor's eyes. However, once the Emperor becomes interested, you're not a simple official. Once he truly begins to doubt your loyalty, there will be a fundamental change in his attitude toward you." "The Emperor is heartless," Fan Jian reminded him, "particularly when the power in your hands is so great that it can even faintly threaten the stability of the Qing Kingdom's dragon throne. If he discovers that there is something strange in your heart, he will certainly mobilize the absolute power in his hands to kill you." Fan Xian was silent. He knew what his father said was right. The biggest problem he had committed in his planning these few years was that he had never made up his mind. Regardless of whether it was to avenge Yi Ching Mei or to wipe away the events of the past and obediently and timidly be a powerful official by the dragon throne, he had to make a decision ahead of time. His mind was so uncertain and indecisive right now. It was truly too embarrassing. "This is a difficult problem for anyone to solve," Fan Xian said with a bitter smile. He smiled bitterly and thought to himself that in his previous life, Such a dramatic conflict and inner struggle could probably only be found in Shakespeare's plays. Who would have thought that the drama of a father killing his mother and the son being caught in the middle would actually fall on him? Fan Xian looked at him calmly with a strange gaze. A moment later, he said, "Actually, after Chen Pingping confirmed that matter, and I guessed it, he and I also considered your problem. However, we truly did not think that it was a problem that was difficult to resolve." Fan Xian didn't quite understand these words. Fan Xian looked at him. His gaze grew gentler and gentler. He sighed and said, "Ng, you truly are an extraordinary person. I had thought that you had never seen your birth mother and had grown up under the Emperor's protection. The Emperor had treated you very well. Logically speaking, you shouldn't have any deep feelings for Xiao Yezi. Given the affection the Emperor had for you, even if you knew about the tragedy of the past, you probably wouldn't be able to summon up the thought of revenge against the Emperor for your birth mother." Fan Xian couldn't resist shaking his head and said, "Sometimes I really don't understand you." Fan Xian had never seen Yi Qingmei in his life. He hadn't grown up healthily under her care. The Emperor had treated him well. "The hatred of killing my mother is absolutely irreconcilable," Fan Xian said quietly, self-mockingly. "Of course, you know that I could not have made a decision because of this reason. It was because Yi Qingmei's aura in this world made Fan Xian feel so familiar, so close, and so amiable. Perhaps it had nothing to do with the feelings of a mother and son. It was just that two connected souls had suddenly gotten closer and closer in this spacious and bustling otherworld. For Fan Xian, Yi Qingmei was someone who had gone before, someone who had come and then left another version of himself. Not fair. Fan Xian looked at his father. For some reason, his heart ached. In an indescribable tone, he quietly said, "If we just let it go like this, it would be too unfair to her." Minister Fan was silent for a long time. He then said, "It is indeed unfair." Perhaps it was because of the word unfair that the old cripple in the Overwatch Council had endured silently for 20 years and planned for 20 years. Carefully and miraculously, he had followed the general trend of the world and the court. He had spent countless efforts to drive all of the Emperor's people, one by one, to the opposite side of the Emperor. It was said that if there were dogs in the world, Ping Ping would chase them. In the end, the old cripple had finally succeeded. Everything that had happened in the 7th year of the Qin calendar had been a point he had calculated and waited for a long time. Under the circumstances at the time, the Qin Emperor faced the greatest danger of his life. The wind had risen on Dong Mountain and gathered clouds. However, the Emperor had still returned alive from Dong Mountain. The Justice Chun Ping wanted became a flower in the mirror and a shadow in the water. He would not be able to find a second chance. "I have to make arrangements for Chun Ping first." Fan Xian had already shaken off his earlier emotions. Looking at his father, he quietly said, "Of the old comrades from back then, some have died, some have rebelled, and some are still struggling. The director is different from you. He has always been dissatisfied. That is why he has endured in Jingdo these 2 years. Now that you have taken the position of director, it looks like the Emperor still wants to give us old fellows a way out," Fan Xian said with a warm smile. Fan Jian smiled warmly. "As long as nothing unforeseen happens, His Majesty will probably let that old dog leave the capital. Don't worry." A faint worry rose in Fan Xian's heart. He didn't know where this worry came from. He just felt that things wouldn't go so smoothly. In his original plan, after Chun Ping and his father were far away from Jingdo, he would deal with the Emperor alone in Jingdo and use the Dongyi matter to delay the Emperor's steps for 2 years. He would listen to his words and observe his actions. It could be considered a safe move. Seeing the worry between Fan Xian's brows, Minister Fan furrowed his brows and asked, "Is there any new movement in Jingdo?" "Is still the same as in the past year. The Imperial Censorate checks and balances the Overwatch Council, and He Zonwei is doing very well." Fan Xian shook his head. Recently, other than Sun Jingxiu's side, nothing major has happened in the capital. Minister Fan's expression froze slightly. He asked about the matter of the Jingdo government a while ago. After thinking silently for a long time, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "This matter is strange." Fan Xian was slightly surprised and looked at his father. He didn't know where to start. The internal strife in the officialdom in Jingdo was clearly on a completely different level compared to the major matter the father and son had discussed earlier. Yet his father took it so seriously. From the Imperial Censorate to the Hall of Governmental Affairs, and then you taking over the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian said in a cold voice. Fan Jian said in a cold voice, "This is something we have discussed before. The Emperor has arranged for the Qin Kingdom behind him. At the moment, Dong Yi is still negotiating. The matter of the northern expedition has not even begun to be prepared. The Emperor's arrangement this time is clearly too rushed. He wants to help his own way into power to check and balance you, causing these things." Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. Too rushed, too rushed. Fan Xian understood his father's words and also sank into deep thought. It was indeed so. During these 2 years, the Emperor seemed to have been too anxious to make future arrangements for the Qin court. His speed had been a bit too rushed. A gust of mountain wind blew in through the open glass window, bringing with it a chill. The light in the study flickered for a while, illuminating the father and son's expressions. After a moment of oppressive silence, Fan Xian lowered his voice and said, "Is there something wrong with the Emperor's body?" Fan Xian thought for a long time and then shook his head. "You have more people in the palace than I do, even more than Shan Pingping. If you haven't received any news, then it cannot be confirmed. But if the Emperor truly has a problem with his body, he would certainly hide it," Fan Xian said with a heavy expression. "If he is sick, he has to go to the Imperial Academy of Medicine for treatment." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "As long as there is a record in the Imperial Academy of Medicine, presumably you have the ability to see it." "No." Fan Xian shook his head. "These 2 years, I have been paying close attention to this area, but there has been no news in the palace. If there is something wrong with the Emperor's body and he has not summoned the Imperial doctors to treat it, then there is only one reason." Fan Xian sat up straight and slowly said, "The problem with the Emperor's body is something he knows very well. It is impossible for the Imperial doctors to cure it." Fan Xian's heart jumped, and he unconsciously said, "Is there still a problem with the tyrannical Jinchi that has reached the realm of the way of the Emperor?" Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. "Logically speaking, at the realm of a great grandmaster, normal poisons should not be able to enter the heart meridians. What problem could there be? Never mind. This is just a wild guess from you and me without any reason. You can't take this matter seriously." Fan Xian also smiled and said, "That is true. However, I am very interested in how the Emperor crossed that barrier and practiced the way of the King's Scroll. It is a pity that the Emperor always said that I would not be able to use that method, so I have never had a clue." "Where are you going next?" Fan Xian suddenly asked. "To Dong Yi." Fan Xian was startled. He didn't know why his father would suddenly ask this. "Concerning the matter of the nameless martial secret, I can't give any opinion. Since you're going to Dong Yi, there should be someone you can ask about whether or not the Emperor has a problem with his cultivation." Fan Xian looked at him calmly and said, "Sigu Jian is about to die. Before he dies, if you can make some progress, you will be able to protect yourself in the future." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. It was difficult to improve one step further. Although Sigu Jian had already taught him everything he knew in Dong Yi, what could he do? However, he knew his father was right. Concerning the secret of the nameless martial secret, and how the Emperor was able to break through the final restrictions of the tyrannical scroll on the human body, Sigu Jian was, without question, his last teacher. Chapter 668. I haven't been feeling well. Maybe it's because the legendary days have finally arrived. The low tide, the so-called low tide, has finally arrived. I don't know if it's a psychological problem or something else, but I'm under a lot of pressure. I can't extricate myself. I've been sitting there for 4 hours, but my mind is empty. I'm not drunk. I'm not sick. There's nothing. I just can't write anymore. My hands are placed on the keyboard, and I start to feel disgusted. This state is very strange. It happened twice when I was writing about Shizuku, but this is the first time I'm writing about the year after Chinyu. I've tried to analyze my recent mental state. Being busy and tired is part of the reason, but I think the real reason why I'm writing harder and harder is the year of Chinyu itself. This story is slowly coming to an end. Maybe it's because I subconsciously don't want to write the end, so I'm starting to feel disgusted with every word I type. Because there's a fixed content, every additional word you write will reduce the content of the story by one word, and then it will get smaller and smaller until there's nothing left. I'm sick of this feeling. It's probably the same feeling I had when I read the last half of Jean Yong's novel 20 years ago and saw the number of pages between my thumb and index finger dwindle. I need a rest for a day. I need to adjust my mental state and then force myself to wake up and fall into madness. I don't have any craziness. It's like I can't overcome it. I don't know if other writers have this feeling, but I do. I won't add this chapter. On the 15th, I'll only add the chapter where I asked for sick leave. Chapter 669. A milky white mist slowly accumulated in the mountain valley. However, the morning sun slowly rose over the eastern sea. Painstakingly climbing over countless mountains, it threw its warmth and light into the air above the mountain manor, causing the white mist to slowly dissipate. It seemed that in just an instant, the sky had brightened. In the green mountain valley filled with trees, the birds chirped as they woke up. Dew dripped from the leaves. Freed from their heavy burden, the leaves bounced back happily like they were stretching. The entire mountain valley was filled with a fresh, breathing feeling. Fan Xian rubbed his slightly sore eyes and sat by the bed for a while before waking up. Last night, he had talked too long with his father and slept too late, so he was not used to it. Not many people in Tin Family Village knew of his arrival. There are no servants or serving girls in this place. When he pushed open the wooden door and felt the cool mountain wind hit his face, he couldn't help but be surprised when he saw the basin of hot water at his feet. Sitting on the threshold, he wrung out a towel in the basin of hot water and wiped his face forcefully until his cheeks were slightly red. Only then did he feel a sense of satisfaction. He threw the towel back into the basin and carried it into the courtyard to the side, indicating for his subordinates to keep quiet when they saw him. The entire morning, Fan Xian served his father, brought tea and water, cooked food, and massaged his back. He had been reborn for 20 years. Most of it had been in Danzhou and Jingdou. It had also been 3 years since he had seen his father. He knew that he was not actually a competent son. It was rare that he was in a foreign mountain valley and had nothing else to worry about. He took his duties as a son seriously. Minister Fan was only surprised in the beginning. Once he understood what he was thinking, he only smiled and let him be. Calm and unruffled, he was served by his son, casually eating some plain porridge and white bread. The father and son pushed open the courtyard door and followed the wide straight path of Tin Family Village toward the large mountain beside the village. The straight path was still covered by a faint white mist. It was impossible to see clearly the cracks in the stone slabs under their feet. Fan Xian carefully supported his father. As they walked, he quietly spoke with him. The straight path had 3 horizontal and 1 vertical. Although it was in the white mist, it was possible to see that the standard was very high and very spacious. It did not match the height of the buildings in the mountain village at all. Fan Xian knew that this was an advanced preparation for future transportation needs. A branch of peach blossom peeked out from the white fog. Minister Fan pointed at it and quietly said something. Fan Xian, who was at his side, nodded repeatedly. Next to another stone well, Minister Fan said a few more words, and Fan Xian nodded again. On the way out in the morning, Minister Fan warmly explained to Fan Xian what the workshop would be used for in the future, who would be stationed in the house, and how the 3 workshops would be placed if they were to rise again. Just like that, they talked and walked. It didn't take long for the father and son to walk along the stone path into the Green Mountain. They only stopped when they reached the side of the mountain next to a flying rock. The father and son turned their heads at the same time to look down the mountain. They saw a streak of golden light penetrating thousands of li from the east. In an instant, it swept away the white mist in the mountain valley, revealing its true appearance. There were countless different kinds of residences arranged in picturesque disorder in the valley, following the direction of the straight path. Between the green walls and black eaves, an occasional old tree peeked out. It was incomparably fresh. In the distance, they could faintly see a few wisps of smoke curling up from kitchen chimneys. Presumably, the people who had woken up early were boiling water and cooking. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked into the mountain valley. He saw the densely packed residences gradually growing farther and farther between the two mountains. They stretched out toward the east. He couldn't see the end. Last night, he had only seen the starlight beneath his feet. Now that he had seen its true appearance, he realized that the 10-family village was now such a grand existence. Thinking of the hard work of these 2 years, thinking of the people who had worked hard for the 10-family village, and seeing the results in front of him, a smile gradually spread between his brows, lips, and teeth. Treasuring a wall is a crime. Minister Fan supported his tired waist and smiled as he panted. Right now, it is just a shell. If you actually put the gemstones in and the news gets out, I'm afraid everyone in the world will come and take a bite out of you. Not many people have the power to bite me, Fan Xian replied with a smile. Minister Fan shook his head in disapproval. Although the valley is easy to defend and difficult to attack, how can a mere few thousand people stop the attack of a country's army? Last night, Father showed me the map. If the Emperor were to send out troops to attack, Dongyi and northern Xi'an between should have some reaction. Dongyi will soon be part of the Qing kingdom. That is only in name. Without 10 years of effort, it will be difficult for the Qing kingdom to peacefully bring Dongyi into their system. What about Dongyi themselves? Or perhaps the northern Qi people? Minister Fan looked at him with a slight smile. The inheritance your mother left behind has great allure. No one can resist it. This place is already close to northern Qi. How could the northern Qi people let it go? Fan Xian smiled and helped his father sit on a rock halfway up the mountain. After thinking for a moment, he said, I have a way to keep the little emperor in check on northern Qi. Even if she is blinded by the diamonds, I have a way to make her give up on this idea. A second palace treasury has appeared in the world. Do you think the ruler of a country can just give it up if he says so? Minister Fan used an amused gaze to examine his son. Although I don't know where your confidence in the northern Qi emperor comes from, if this matter were to get out, the civil and military officials of northern Qi would certainly be drooling. Even if the little emperor doesn't want to offend you, how could he stop the will of the entire country? Fan Xian stood by his father's side and withdrew his gaze from below. With a pained smile, he said, What can I do? This has always been a hot potato. Putting aside the emperor's side for now, even in the future, if I want to protect this place, I need to be strong enough. All right, we'll do as you say. Putting aside the emperor for now, Minister Fan smiled. The father and son both knew that the greatest danger to 10-family village still came from the emperor in Jingdo. Let's talk about the 3 countries. You have to contend with them. How much power do you have right now to protect this place? I have the most 9th-level aces in the world under my command. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said seriously, More than the emperor. Are you sure Sigu Jian is willing to give those people to you? Minister Fan asked. Even if he is willing to give them to you, once he dies, how will you control the people in the Sore Hut? That will depend on how Sigu Jian handles it, Fan Xian replied. As for whether to give them or not, I don't think he needs to consider it. This matter has the greatest benefit for Dongyi. Speaking of benefits, I am truly worried about the people of the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian suddenly became gloomy. This is only a supplement, a backup, and a threat. Fan Xian pressed his lips together and quietly said, If we don't have to use it, that would be the best outcome. The white fog in the valley had long dissipated. Being forced by the gradually rising temperature of the ground, it floated upward invisibly. Halfway up the mountain, it met with the slightly cool mountain wind blowing through the valleys and gradually seeped out a white mist. The Fan father and son sat among the white clouds on a green rock. Mist swirled around them. Their sleeves fluttered lightly, making them look like 2 immortals. Not far away, on the side of the path leading into the mountain, a farmer was chopping wood. He forcefully suppressed the curiosity in his heart and did not turn his gaze toward the two figures in the clouds. Even further away, there were a few branches hidden in the darkness. These people were the guards of 10 Family Village, secretly protecting the buildings and people here. Naturally, the existence of these people could not be hidden from Fan Xian. They probably could not be hidden from Minister Fan either. The two of them did not want to alarm too many people. They only silently watched the clouds rise and fall around them. They had been silent for a long time. Suddenly, Minister Fan calmly said, "For a person to be able to change a world from his bones is something that has never happened in the thousands of years of history." Fan Xian did not reply. He knew what his father was talking about. Your mother was a genius. She had the bearing and talent of a celestial. Perhaps she wanted to use her own power to change this world. However, in the end, she still failed. Minister Fan's expression was cold and wooden. However, there was an indescribable regret in this coldness and wooden. He raised his arm and waved his sleeve amidst the faint mist. Pointing at the buildings in the valley, he said emotionally, "Many years ago, on that wasteland in the north of Min, I was also like today, looking at the boundless magnificence of the scene born out of desolation. Your mother's mind always had so many strange and wonderful ideas. Not only did she convince the people of the world, she also seemed to have convinced the heavens of the restrictions they gave us. How could one not be moved?" Fan Xian listened and was moved slightly. Back then, if your mother had not died, the palace treasury would certainly not be what it is now. Based on her thoughts, the Yi family's business would eventually spread all over the world. Minister Fan sighed. "I originally did not approve of your intention to build this 10-family village. Thinking of your mother's wish, I let you do it. In those years, these years, I have been thinking about a question. That is, where did your mother come from? What did she want to do in this world? Also, why did she leave?" Fan Xian sat down and sat close to his father in silence. Minister Fan's thin face appeared particularly calm in the mountain wind. "Us old people have all experienced things from many years ago. We can guess that your mother came from that illusory temple. Wu Zhu was her guard. The temple has never been involved in worldly affairs. Why would there be such a dreamlike story?" Fan Xian hugged his knees with his hands and gently pressed his face against them. He looked at his father from the side and sank into a daze. He knew that his father had once been a famous dissolute scholar in Jingdao. Poetry, literature, calligraphy, and painting were all among the best in the world. It was only later that his companions began to plot for the world that he gave up those spiritual things and threw himself into dry and important matters such as accounts. Halfway up the mountain beside 10-family village, Fan Xian, who had already retired from the position of Minister of Revenue in the Qin Kingdom for 3 years, finally returned to the appearance of an artistic youth. However, the youth was approaching old age. If it was truly the Emperor's web back then, why was Wu Zhu moved away? Minister Fan's voice suddenly became sharp. He stared at Fan Xian and said, "In this world, there's only one kind of threat that could move Wu Zhu away from your mother's side." Fan Xian muttered, "The temple." Correct. If someone from the temple hadn't descended, Wu Zhu would certainly not have left Jingdao to stop that person. Minister Fan said with narrowed eyes. Minister Fan narrowed his eyes and said, "If all of this was part of the Emperor's plan, how did he know that people from the temple would come? How could he come into contact with the illusory temple? You suspect that the Emperor was working with the temple?" Fan Xian sat up straight. His hands left his legs as he looked at his father. Minister Fan lowered his eyelids slightly and said, "These years, Chen Pingping and I have guessed. The reason we haven't done anything is because we still respect and fear the temple in our hearts. If the Emperor is truly the person designated by the temple, what can we do? If only Wu Zhu had not lost his memory. He should know the secret of the temple." He looked at Fan Xian warmly and said, "If you are truly going to break off relations with the Emperor, you must make this matter clear. We are all mortals. We are not your mother. It is impossible for mortals to oppose the temple." Fan Xian's expression was calm. Even after hearing about the temple, he still did not feel a glimmer of fear. Uncle Wu Zhu has already left. Where did he go? He went home to the temple to have a look. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly. Before he left, he said that there was no one left in the temple. Father, don't worry too much. If the temple truly does not interfere in worldly affairs, then he will not be able to affect me at all. How many years has Wu Zhu been gone? Almost 3 years. He still hasn't returned in 3 years. Minister Fan slowly closed his eyes. I'm afraid there are some problems. Fan Xian didn't reply. He was also incomparably worried about Uncle Wu Zhu. However, he had never thought of using the worldly affairs of the world to stop Uncle Wu Zhu's journey to find him. Furthermore, from the beginning, he knew that the temple hidden in the ice and snow must have played some sort of role in the story from many years ago. Hearing his father's analysis, he was increasingly certain of this point. Back then, Chen Pingping insisted that you send Xiao In back to Northern Qi. You should know now why. Yes, in the world, only Xiao In, Ku He, and Uncle Wu Zhu know where the temple is. Naturally, Ku He would not say, and Uncle Wu Zhu has never remembered. Only Xiao In knows, Fan Xian replied. The old director wanted me to know the secret of the temple. With these words, Fan Xian's eyelashes suddenly blinked. Many things from the past and the future were strung together in his heart. He even clearly remembered the conversation he had with the old man in the wheelchair by the pool in the Overwatch Council beside the fish that had sunk to the bottom of the sand. Chen Pingping waved his hand and furrowed his brows. In the future, you have to learn to open up your sights. Don't always stare at a single ministry, a single department, a mere official, a mere Jingdo. You have to learn to stand higher. Fan Xian replied. Do I have to place my sights on the entire world? Chen Pingping smiled. Perhaps it should be higher. Where should one place their sights higher than the world be? Naturally, it was the temple high above the clouds and deep in the cold. Fan Xian's expression changed slightly. Only now did he understand that a long time ago, Chen Pingping had guessed that the temple stood behind the emperor. That was why he had him send Xiao In back to the north to remind him that the emperor was not just one person. Since you understand, it is good. The emperor himself is already incomparably powerful, but there is still a temple standing behind him. Minister Fan's eyes remained closed. Thus, I cannot summon any thoughts of rebelling against him. Since you dare, you have to dig up the roots. Fan Xian did not reply. In reality, Uncle Wu Zhu returning home had always been a hidden move in his plan. To deal with the temple, only a great grandmaster and above could do it. Uncle Wu Zhu returned to the temple, while Fan Xian stayed in this world to continue his training. Although Wu Zhu thinks there is no one in the temple, Minister Fan furrowed his brows. Who knows? Based on what you said, he has already left for over 2 years, yet there has been no news of him. What if something happened to him there? I don't know either. A feeling of defeat rose in Fan Xian's heart. However, in front of the emperor, he had already experienced too many defeats. It was so many that he was almost numb, so he did not care. In the future, if things do not work out, I will go to the temple to find him. Even if he dies, I will dig up his body from the snow. Fan Xian's heart felt a wave of coldness. Within the coldness, there was a glimmer of heat that could not be extinguished. Resolutely and calmly, he said, "This has nothing to do with the Qing kingdom. It is only my business." Uncle Wu Zhu was his closest family. He was an indispensable part of his life. If something happened to Uncle Wu Zhu, even if Fan Xian continued to live, he would not be able to live comfortably. If he could not live comfortably, what was the point of living? Minister Fan looked at him calmly. He knew that the secret regarding the temple was hidden in the depths of this kid's heart. Thinking of how he had been hiding it from him all these years, Minister Fan was not angry. On the contrary, he was happy. There are not many young people in this world with such shrewdness. Probably only young people like this could survive in the struggle against the emperor and live better and better. Things do not work out. Although he admired him in his heart, Minister Fan still said mockingly, "If that day truly comes, Do you think the Emperor will still let you live on the path to find the temple? I don't know. This was the second time Fan Xian had said he didn't know. There were not many unfathomable people in this world, but the Emperor was clearly one of them. Fan Xian did not wish to completely break off relations with the man on the throne. Firstly, there was some affection. Secondly, Fan Xian knew that, no matter what, he was no match for the Emperor. I don't know, Fan Xian repeated. Fan Xian repeated. But to live, there are always things that must be done. So what if you lose? Although the Emperor is incomparably powerful, if he wants to kill me, it will not be a simple matter. He smiled bitterly and said, unless he is willing to leave the royal palace, throw aside state affairs, and chase me all over the world. Minister Fan smiled slightly and said, this kind of thing is truly not in line with his personality. However, you are his most trusted and favored official. If he discovers that you have truly betrayed him, it would not be surprising if he did anything under the agitation of such emotions. Then, I can only pray for the blessings of the heavens, Fan Xian said with a slight smile. So it's still the same thing. Before Uncle Wu Zhu returns, I don't want to have a falling out with the Emperor. Minister Fan also smiled. He finally understood that his hesitation these 2 years was not just because of the unease he felt under the pressure of ethics. It was also because he was waiting and had to stall for time. If the source of the Emperor's powerful confidence was the Qing Kingdom's powerful national strength, the endless money in the palace treasury, the scheming techniques that controlled the world, and his own powerful grandmaster cultivation, Fan Xian's confidence came from the part of the Overwatch Council that belonged to him. He had enough information in his head to rebuild the palace treasury, banknotes in his pocket to rebuild the palace treasury, and that powerful Wu Zhu. I hope Yi Luyan is truly gone out to sea. Minister Fan glanced at Fan Xian with deep meaning. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He knew what his father wanted to remind him of. A moment later, he said, I also hope so. Fan Xian only stayed in Tin Family Village for a day. He secretly met with the Qingyu Hall shopkeepers who had been rescued from Jingdou. Both sighed endlessly. Although these old shopkeepers were already dead in the records of the Qing court, they still had relatives in Jingdou and friends in the 3 workshops in Jiangnan. Fan Xian had been worried that if he left these old shopkeepers in Tin Family Village, they would have other thoughts. But after meeting them, he found that these old shopkeepers were particularly passionate about the rebuilding of the palace treasury. They even wanted to throw the rest of their lives into it. For the oldie shopkeepers, this had nothing to do with the *T palace treasury. They also didn't care how much the Qing Kingdom's national strength would be weakened. They only thought that these things had always belonged to the Yi family. Back then, they had been taken by the shameless Qing royal family. Now that the young master wanted to rebuild the Yi family, tears began to flow. Old Ma's heart began to jump. Fan Xian and the old shopkeepers once again checked the flow charts of the 3 workshops and once again confirmed the possibility of Tin Family Village's future. They finally completed the goal of this trip. At dusk, he bowed deeply to his father and then left the large village alone, walking into the deep valley. He was halfway up the mountain. When he turned his head back to look, the valley was already dark. The lights gradually lit up like the stars in the sky. He raised his head and looked up. The sky was dotted with stars like the lights of the mortal world. The starlight filled the sky. He didn't know whether it was falling from the sky or rising from the ground. It was extremely beautiful. Chapter 670. Dongi. At the foot of the hill outside the city, the wretched yellow grass hut was as quiet as before. There was no sword light, sword wind, or the sound of swords slicing through the air. There was only silence. It was already late spring and close to summer. The blazing sun shone on the ocean to the east of the land, raising endless amounts of water vapor. It plunged all of Dongi into a humid heat. Fortunately, the sea breeze never stopped, so it could slightly relieve the boredom. Ever since the battle at Dong Mountain 3 years ago, the disciples of the Sword Hut had moved their practice area outside. No one dared to disturb the sword saint's recovery in the depths of the hut. That was why the hut appeared so quiet. The invisible water vapor that filled the air grew colder as the sun sank. It sank toward the ground and slowly attached itself to the scraps of swords and metal, forming a few water droplets. The setting sun gradually set. A faint red light shone into the depths of the sword hut and into the large pit. It clearly reflected the water droplets on the countless swords. They seeped into the blood-red color, making it look like blood. A few black flies flew in from somewhere and curiously circled the sword pit, making a disgusting buzzing sound. These creatures didn't know what kind of position and reputation this pit, the swords in it, represented. They only instinctively stared at the red water droplets on the swords. They were incomparably confused. Why didn't this blood have a hint of a pleasant fishy smell? The weather was hot, so the natural icy fiendish aura in the sword grave was much fainter. That was why these black flies had enough courage to fly around. However, in the dark room next to the sword grave, there was an icy coldness that was completely different from the outside environment. Perhaps it was because the room had not seen light for a long time, or perhaps it was because the great Grandmaster lying on the bed was gradually approaching death, giving off a heart-palpitating coldness. There were no black flies, spiders, or webs in the room. No mosquito dared to bite the person wrapped in the thick blankets. In a corner of the snow-white wall, there was a long-legged mosquito about the size of a fingernail, staring fixedly at the person it had bitten. The long-legged mosquito was shivering, its transparent wings stroking its withered body from time to time, reminding itself that it was still alive. Its two long legs also seemed particularly weak, and its whole body was suffused with an unhealthy brownish-yellow color, as if it was about to turn into a shell. It didn't fly away because it didn't find anyone in the hut that it could suck blood from. The people in the hut seemed to have some strange magic power. As long as it got close to them, it would be repelled by an invisible barrier and killed. Only the dying man on the bed didn't have that kind of ability, but the long-legged mosquito still didn't dare to fly down because it felt a chill coming from the dying man. In this hot day, it was so cold that it almost couldn't bear it, but it was still enduring because it knew that the person was about to die. No matter how powerful a person was, as long as he died, he would turn into blood and rotten flesh. It needed blood, and the Black Fly brothers outside needed rotten flesh. Under the thick blankets, Sigu Jian's entire body was icy cold. He trembled endlessly. Each tremble brought with it a tearing pain from the wound in his chest. 3 years ago, he had been struck by the Qing Emperor's fist, and one of his arms had been torn off by Yi Luyan. A month ago, he had been stabbed twice in the chest by the shadow. Even though the poison Fei Jie had planted had already frozen all of his wounds, there was no longer any sign of life. Logically speaking, he should have died a long time ago, but he didn't die. He only opened his eyes and stared woodenly at the snow-white wall in the room and the long-legged mosquito in the corner. He watched as the mosquito trembled and suffered, waiting for the mosquito to not be able to endure it and fall off the wall. The emotions in the great Grandmaster's eyes were indifferent and calm. It was as if he had long seen through everything in the world, including the last part of life, the great fear between life and death. There was not a sliver of the ruthless killing intent from when he had killed 100 tiger guards, nor was there a sliver of the bloody sword intent from when he had massacred the manor. There was also not a sliver of the soaring, unyielding fighting spirit. There wasn't even the interest from many years ago when he watched the ants move under the tree. There was only calmness in the shadow of the withered, yellow-brown, trembling, long-legged mosquito. Sigu Jian, on the verge of death, refused to die because he was waiting for someone. The room door was gently pushed open. The slightly warm twilight outside seeped in and cast the young man's long shadow on the ground. Sigu Jian did not waste the last of his life. He glanced at him and didn't open his mouth to say anything. He knew that since the other party had rushed back, he would tell him some things he wanted to hear. Fan Xian left Jingdo and turned toward Weizhou. He then stealthily made his way to Tin Family Village. After traveling arduously for several days, he finally met up with the Overwatch Council group outside Dongi. He didn't waste any time and rushed to the sword hut. Under Yunjilan's somewhat indifferent gaze, he pushed open the door and entered. He pushed open the door and entered again. He passed through 3 layers of doors and came to Sigu Jian's side with the sound of hurried footsteps. He looked at Sigu Jian's head, which was exposed outside the thick quilt. Only then did he realize that this sword saint great grandmaster's body was indeed very thin and weak. Even with 3 layers of quilts, it was still a very small section. Thus, his head appeared to be particularly large. Even at this stage, Sigu Jian was still not dead. This reality made Fan Xian feel secretly shocked. He looked at the old and cold face and said, "If the shape of the pool is not destroyed, one should draw in the spring water to fill one's body." He didn't say anything about the Qing Emperor's edict. He didn't discuss Dongi's future. He didn't speak of the secret in his heart. In the first instant, Fan Xian recited the nameless martial secret he had cultivated since he was young, clearly and generously, sentence by sentence. The nameless martial secret was divided into 2 volumes. Fan Xian had only cultivated the first volume in over 20 years of his life. Although he knew the second volume by heart, he hadn't made any progress. It was as if these words were carved into his mind and would not fade. It only took him a few breaths to recite them in front of Sigu Jian's bed. He didn't have to worry about whether or not Sigu Jian could understand or remember. Even if he was about to die, he was still a great grandmaster. Following Fan Xian's words, Sigu Jian's gaze gradually moved away from the mosquito in the corner of the wall. No one knew where he was staring at. His indifferent gaze became sharp and focused like a sword. The body of the sword gradually glowed, shining and burning. Fan Xian's lips closed. He then waited silently and quietly to the side. Without needing him to open his mouth to explain, Sigu Jian could tell from these exquisite sentences and the strange and unusually crude method of circulating qi that the heart he was reciting was the Qing Emperor's tyrannical true secret. Sigu Jian's eyes gradually grew brighter as Fan Xian recited. As Fan Xian closed his mouth, they dimmed. "How do I cultivate the second half?" Fan Xian asked respectfully with his head lowered. "I cannot." Sigu Jian's voice was very weak and raspy, but his answer was very determined. Fan Xian was not disappointed. He continued to calmly ask, "But the emperor cultivated the second half. It is the way of the king. The pinnacle of the tyrannical way is the way of the king." Perhaps it was because he had finally learned the secret of the Qing Emperor's martial method before he died, but Sigu Jian's spirit was much better than before. His voice gradually became smoother. With slight mockery, he said, "The tyrannical at the peak is still the tyrannical. Did your emperor really think there could be any substantial change? Reality has already proven this," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "The emperor has fixed the second half of the scroll. I want to know how he did it, and if it will affect him in any way." Sigu Jian sank into silence. A slight doubt gradually appeared in his light gaze. In the end, it immediately turned into a smile of understanding. In a quiet voice, he said, "The meridians of the physical body will always have a limit. Even for a little strange creature like you, there will always be a limit. That is why, under the tree and in the manner of the master of the city, you taught me that I should put my heart first. A person's physical body will always have a limit, but the heart and will have no limit," Fan Xian continued. Tyrannical, Sigu Jian coughed. His icy body trembled under the blankets. No one knew better than this great grandmaster that no matter how extraordinary a person was, once their vitality was broken and their physical body was destroyed, they were no different from a normal person. If one can truly surpass the limits of the human body. Sigu Jian slowly closed his eyes and began to play out the scenes on Dong Mountain in his mind. The rain fell on a mountaintop. That finger broke through the rain and landed between Kuhi's brows. In an instant, half the lake's water went in and forcefully burst through Imperial Advisor Kuhi's sea of qi. It was that finger. Sigurd abruptly opened his eyes. His pupils rapidly constricted. In the end, they shrank to a small black dot like the tip of a sword. In a very slow voice, he said, "One finger to move half the lake." No one can move vital energy so quickly because at the end of the cultivation of the meridians of the human body, no matter how broad, there are still limits. Fan Xian had not been on a mountain at the time and didn't know what Sigurd was thinking. He didn't quite understand these words. He thought to himself that every person who practiced martial arts and raised their realm revolved around reality and power. The power was the so-called skill. Now, he had to add the heart that Sigurd had taught him. However, reality was a person's true cultivation. Regardless of whether it was a normal cultivator's sea of qi and dantian, his own two circulations, or the snowy mountains behind his back, one had to have a foundation and then follow the meridians to move. The human body had meridians, so it had to be limited by them. He felt that Sigurd words were nonsense. However, Fan Xian gradually realized what Sigurd was saying. His expression changed slightly. Complicated emotions seeped out of Sigurd cold and serene eyes. In the end, these emotions became a thick sense of mockery, coupled with the slight wrinkle that he had forced out with difficulty at the corner of his mouth. It appeared harsh and disdainful. A low and strange laugh rang out from Sigurd dry lips. It was particularly ear-piercing. No one knew if he was laughing at the Qing Emperor himself or Fan Xian's overestimation of his own abilities to want to learn the latter half of the nameless martial secret. He looked at Fan Xian calmly and said each word clearly. There are no meridians in the Qing Emperor's body. Although Fan Xian had already guessed a little from Sigurd words earlier, hearing these words abruptly, it was still like his mind had been struck by lightning. His mind buzzed with shock and confusion. The Emperor had no meridians in his body? But how could someone without meridians survive? The latter half of the scroll still walks the path of the tyrannical way. If you continue to practice it, your meridians will explode and you will die. Even if you're lucky, you can only become a cripple for life. Sigurd looked at Fan Xian and coldly said, "If you don't explode your meridians, it is impossible for you to do the methods in the second half of the scroll. Those directions are not normal. Even if you practice for another 50 years, it will be useless." Fan Xian took a few deep breaths and forcefully suppressed the shock in his heart. He knew that Sigurd analysis was correct. A few years ago, he had already practiced the tyrannical Jinshi to the peak. At that time, he had already stepped into the doorstep of the 9th level and was in high spirits. Outside the Jingdo government yamen, he had broken Xiebai An's sword with his fist. Unexpectedly, it had caused the Jinshi in his body to explode and injure his meridians. He had painstakingly healed his injuries. In the end, after the Hanging Temple, during a pursuit and the Shadow's desire to kill, the hidden danger in his body exploded again. In the end, he was stabbed by the Shadow and seriously injured. Fan Xian had encountered the hidden danger of practicing the tyrannical martial method twice. More accurately speaking, when he was still a child, teacher Fei Jia had already sensed the great danger he would inevitably encounter in the future. That was why he had left him that large red pill. In the end, the large red pill had been sent into the Empress Dowager's mouth. Fan Xian knew it was only because he was lucky that he had survived after his Jinshi had broken the limit twice and his meridians had been greatly damaged. He had relied on Begonia Duodwa's life-saving grace and Northern Qi's Tianyi Dao's secret natural martial method. In Jiangnan, he had used Tianyi Dao's natural Jinshi to repair for a long time before he had healed the damage to his meridians. It was not until the two completely different types of Jinshi had been cultivated to great success at the same time and circulated in two separate circulations in his body, supporting each other. Only then did he truly distance himself from the danger of Jinshi exploding in his body and the shadow that had accompanied him since his childhood. However, he had received confirmation from Sigurd mouth that if he wanted to practice the second half of the scroll, he would have to allow the Jinshi to explode in his body and shatter all the meridians in his body. Fan Xian's face became deathly pale. Lying frozen in bed, difficult to eat and difficult to speak, such a life was not for a person to live. Furthermore, with all the meridians in his body shattered, how could he survive? Whether or not he can survive after his meridians are shattered is up to fate, Sigu Jian said coldly. Without question, the Qing Emperor is a very lucky person. Even if he was about to die, Sigu Jian would not admit that the Qing Emperor was fated. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then shook his head. Luck cannot solve problems. My luck was not bad. The first time my meridians were damaged, I did not die. But I know that if my meridians are completely shattered, I can only become a useless person. Furthermore, the pain that is everywhere in my body is not something a person can endure. But the Qing Emperor endured it and lived. Sigu Jian lowered his eyelids slightly and sighed imperceptibly. Fan Xian had sunk into a state of stupidity. He had many dreams or ideals in this life. Putting aside the worldly problems of his wife, children, and money, the nameless martial secret that had accompanied him for his entire second life had faintly become a part of his life. Although he had never said it explicitly, in his heart, he greatly desired to be able to practice this martial secret to the second volume. It had nothing to do with breaking through realms and becoming a great grandmaster. It was purely a desire. However, this desire had become an extravagant hope that could not be reached. To be able to survive after his meridians had shattered and endure the inhuman pain, forcefully gather the bits of Jinqi in his body that had scattered like starlight, endure the annoyance of his entire body being stiff, defend his will, and recultivate. Fan Xian suddenly remembered that Chen Pingping and his father had once mentioned to him that during the Qing Kingdom's first northern expedition against the Wei Kingdom, the emperor had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Commander Zhang Qingfeng. He himself had also been heavily injured. His entire body was stiff, unable to move, and he had almost died. It looked like the emperor's breakthrough in his martial secret had happened on the ever-changing and incomparably dangerous battlefield. Fan Xian couldn't help but sigh. Regardless of what his feelings toward the emperor were, when he thought of the scenes on the battlefield, the torture the middle-aged man had experienced in his body, and the miraculous changes, he still felt a sense of admiration. Other than fate, what else is needed? Fan Xian asked to himself. Perseverance, extraordinary perseverance. Otherwise, it would be impossible to endure that kind of pain, the torment between life and death, the fear of being sealed in the darkness and struggling against the unknown, Sigu Jian said indifferently. Although he had never cultivated the nameless martial secret, he only needed a thought to know what kind of training the Qing Emperor had experienced if he wanted to cultivate the second half of the scroll. The Qing Emperor must have been in great pain, very great pain. That is precisely why I was happy just now. Without waiting for Fan Xian to reply, Sigu Jian continued with a raspy laugh. I admire the willpower and perseverance of someone who can endure this. I can't do it, and you can't do it, Sigu Jian said. In this world, there is probably only one person who can have such willpower and be so cruel to himself. You should give up on this thought. Fan Xian lowered his head and didn't know what to say. He only heard Sigu Jian's angry voice ring out by his ear. This is not something a person can practice. Chapter 671. Just because it was not something people practiced did not mean that those who practiced it were not people. It could only mean that the great emperor of the Qing Kingdom had cultivated an incomparably firm and extraordinary heart for the sake of the desire in his heart. Fan Xian sat by Sigu Jian's bed and thought of this matter. He couldn't help but feel a slight chill in his heart. He couldn't suppress the feeling of looking up at a tall mountain. Although the mountain was not necessarily beautiful or approachable, it was tall and distant, piercing straight into the white clouds and making one's expression change. He took a deep breath and rubbed the slightly sore corners of his eyes. In a low voice, he said, in terms of talent, Haitang is enough. In terms of willpower, 13th Wang is enough. In terms of diligence, I don't think I'm worse than anyone. However, up until now, I still can't see any opportunity for the latecomers to take that step. Why is this? Don't ask me. After Sigu Jian's angry curse, he slowly closed his tired eyes. In a raspy voice, he said intermittently, I was just thinking that all of us old fellows are dead, and only the Emperor is left in this world. Presumably, he would be lonely. After a moment of silence, Sigu Jian suddenly continued to say mockingly, I'm afraid that on Dong Mountain, he had already begun to feel lonely. No one knew if the faint mockery at the corners of his lips was directed at the Qing Emperor or himself. Fan Xian suddenly said very seriously, I want to confirm something. Yi Luyun, has he truly left the land? Sigu Jian thought deeply for a long time, and then slowly moved his jaw with great difficulty. Fan Xian took a deep breath and then said, If so, then so be it. Sigu Jian closed his eyes and said, It looks like you finally learned something and decided something during this return to the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian was not surprised that this great grandmaster could determine the emotions hidden in his heart from his words and emotions. After all, he was not a true idiot. Smiling slightly, he said, Even if it's not raining, you still have to bring an umbrella. It's always good to be prepared. Where is Wu Zhu? Sigu Jian immediately pointed out the essence of the problem. Fan Xian did not directly answer his question. Instead, he asked, What do you know about the temple? With these words, Sigu Jian understood Wu Zhu's whereabouts. A rare, peaceful smile rose to his face. The temple? It's just an inanimate object. You don't have to worry too much. Even if your emperor's cultivation method was passed down from the temple, so what? The temple won't personally help him. Fan Xian was not too sure of this. After all, many years ago, it seemed that the temple had heard the Qing emperor's prayers and sent out an envoy to move Uncle Wu Zhu out of Jingdou. Now that Uncle Wu Zhu had gone far away to the temple, just what kind of result he would obtain in the end seemed to have the most fundamental and far-reaching influence on the situation in the world. Sigu Jian closed his eyes. It was as if he could feel the deep worry and faint fear in the depths of Fan Xian's heart. After a moment of silence, he said, The temple is actually just a temple. It's not a true god. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He asked, You've been to the temple? I'm not a freak like Ku He and Xiaowen. Why would I go to that godforsaken place? Sigu Jian furrowed his brows. It was clear that the thoughts in his heart did not match the tone of his words. Besides, I don't know where the temple is. However, he continued, you have to understand one thing. If the temple had truly sent someone to erase the traces your mother left in the world, then the palace treasury would have long disappeared and you would have died. Fan Xian was silent. He thought to himself that this judgment was correct. Of course, we can also determine that the temple has indeed sent an envoy to the human world. Sigu Jian suddenly opened his eyes. They were calm. Don't forget, Wu Zhu, that piece of wood, is also one of the temple's envoys. Since he was able to protect your mother and your safety, this can only mean that the envoy from the temple is not as powerful as you think. Fan Xian raised his brows. He then thought of something Uncle Wu Zhu had once said many years ago. There are not many people left at home. Did this mean that the temple had already fallen and did not have the power to influence the world? Then, why did Uncle Wu Zhu want to go back? Of course, if everything was as he guessed, Fan Xian would be happy to accept this kind of situation. After all, facing a mountain-like emperor already made it difficult for him to bear the pressure. Adding on an unfathomable temple from beyond the heavens would truly damage his confidence to the lowest point. Back then, you once sent Xiao In back to northern Qi. Your mother and Wu Zhu were both people from the temple. Don't you want to go back to the temple and see what that mysterious place is like? Sigu Jian opened his eyes and stared fixedly at Fan Xian. It was as if he wanted to see his true thoughts. It was also like a kind of temptation. Fan Xian listened to these words and then smiled. Looking back at him, he said, If there's a chance, I would still like to go and see. However, that is on the basis that my life can be guaranteed. But for you to say such things at this time, presumably you are very curious? As the pinnacle of human power, Sigu Jian was familiar with Wu Zhu. He faintly knew what the level of power in the temple was. Thus, he was not like the common people in this world, who had a sense of reverence and worship that welled up from the depths of his heart. He was a great grandmaster. His strength was powerful enough to be an equal to the figures in the temple. When he talked about the temple, his tone was not very respectful. On the contrary, there was a purposeful indifference and disdain. However, people were curious, and great grandmasters were no exception. This was especially true for a great grandmaster who was about to die. He was indifferent to everything in the world except for that temple. He still maintained his curiosity and desire to pry into it. After all, in this world, only Xiao and Ku he had been to the temple. Furthermore, these two old men were already dead. Perhaps Yi Qingmei and Wu Zhu came from the temple, but Yi Qingmei was already dead. Wu Zhu was on his way home. The secret of the temple from beyond the heavens was still this world's greatest secret. Sigurd looked at Fan Xian. There was a strange light hidden in the calmness of his gaze. He knew that the only person who knew the location of the temple should be this young man in front of him. I found out from Shaoan's mouth. Uncle Wu Zhu's memory has never been good. Presumably, you know that, Fan Xian said quietly. The temple is in the extreme north. After passing through northern Qi's borders, you still have to travel for many months on the snowy plains and frozen earth until you reach a place where it is always dark. If you are lucky, you will be able to see a grand and solemn black-green building. That is the temple. Sigurd Jin fell silent. Before death came, he finally knew where the temple was. It seemed that he had obtained his wish and should be calm. However, the thin and small figure under the thick blankets clearly gave off a faint sense of melancholy. So, it is in the extreme north where there is no sunlight all day. Is it the netherworld? Sigurd Jin's eyes were like an ancient well as they slowly rippled with ancient lines. He sighed and said, "It is indeed not of this world. Is it the netherworld?" Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the withered face under the quilt. Suddenly, he found that the face gradually emitted some kind of light. Could it be that knowing the location of the temple had caused this dying great-grandmaster to suddenly explode with some kind of obsession? Fan Xian did not explain what the extreme day and extreme night were. These concepts did not belong to this world. There was no need to say it and cause a headache. Since Sigurd Jin was willing to think that the temple did not belong to this world, perhaps this kind of understanding would allow this great grandmaster to retain his concept of this world. Is it the heart yearns for? Sigurd Jin sighed with admiration. I had thought that if the Dong Mountain matter could be successfully concluded, I would travel to the ends of the earth to find the temple. Everyone is curious about the unknown. Fan Xian could understand this kind of emotion. Sigurd Jin's eyes narrowed slightly. Like a cold sword piercing the roof, he said in a raspy voice, "I just want to see if I can tear down that broken temple with the sword in my hand." Tear down the temple. After Fan Xian paused, countless complicated emotions rose in his heart. He had thought that Sigurd Jin was just like Ku He and Xiao in the past, willing to go to the temple from beyond the heavens to satisfy the desire to explore the unknown that was in every life. He had not thought that this great grandmaster wanted to challenge the temple. With a sword behind his back, he walked slowly through the snowy plains, met the green mountains, entered the thick doors, pointed his sword at the illusory temple, and killed all the people in the clouds. What kind of heroic spirit was this? If the Dong Mountain matter had gone as Ku He and Sigurd Jin had planned, and the three sides of the world had settled, Sigurd Jin would have grown tired of this world and probably would have walked the path of challenging the path of heaven. The name for the path of heaven in this world was the temple. Thinking of that scene, even someone as steady as Fan Xian couldn't help but be moved slightly. However, he knew that all of this had already ended with the Emperor's punch on Dong Mountain. In the end, Sigurd Jin would probably never reach the temple in his entire life, much less point his sword at it. This was indeed a pity. "Will you go to the temple?" Sigurd Jin suddenly asked as he stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "I don't know much about the temple, so I don't have any great ill feelings." In his previous life, Fan Xian had seen countless shameless religions. In comparison, the temple in the Qing Kingdom's world was far away and rarely interfered with worldly affairs. Fan Xian approved of this style. Furthermore, because it was mysterious and unfathomable, Fan Xian could not develop too many conflicting emotions. The temple does not interfere with worldly affairs. Sigu Jian smiled slightly. Then, how did your mother come out? How did the world change? Why is the Qing Emperor the current Qing Emperor? Perhaps those lofty people in the temple truly only watch all of this with cold eyes, but we grew up on this land. Why should they watch us live? This kind of feeling is not good. It makes me think of many years ago, under the large tree, watching those ants move and fight, Sigu Jian said coldly. But I'm not an ant. I don't like being watched by others. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, if there is a day in the future when I go to the temple, I will carry your ashes there. Sigu Jian closed his eyes and said, not many of the things you say are true. Fan Xian suddenly realized that this great grandmaster's tone was like that of a child's. He couldn't resist smiling. I'm not a god of death like you. I don't have the courage or power to kill a god. If I have no other choice, I don't want to go to the temple to seek my own destruction. Pausing, Fan Xian scratched his head and said, of course, who knows what will happen in the future? If there is such a day, I will scatter your ashes on the stone steps of the temple and hit the feet of those immortals. It will be considered as fulfilling your wish. Sigu Jian said, then, when you burn it in a few days, you can't make the fire too strong. I don't have many bones in my body. If they were all burned to powder, it wouldn't hurt. You have to leave some large joints. Fan Xian replied, that is indeed something to pay attention to. Between life and death, there was a great fear. Amidst this fear, Sigu Jian and Fan Xian smiled and talked about future matters, the remains, the size of the fire, and where it belonged. The atmosphere was relaxed. However, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a strange sense of sorrow. The sun had mostly set. The sea breeze blew past the city, lightly brushing across thousands of li. It went straight into the depths of the grass hut and stirred up a gust of wind outside the quiet room of the sword hut. Thousands of swords in the pit moved at the same time, making a ringing sound that moved one's heart. Sigu Jian turned his head with great difficulty. His gaze flashed past Fan Xian's shoulder and looked at the stubborn and idiotic long-legged mosquito in the corner of the wall. It was already at the end of its life, unable to eat and unwilling to fly away. He sank into a long silence. Fan Xian sat by his side. Suddenly, he bent down and quietly told him about the matter of Tin Family Village by his ear. Tin Family Village was located between northern Qi and Dongyi. If it truly wanted to grow, it could not do without the powerful support of the Sword Hut. The existence of Tin Family Village would certainly bring great benefits to Dongyi. Unexpectedly, after Sigu Jian heard that the Yi family was preparing to open a second battlefield in Dongyi, his expression remained calm and unchanging. He only stared at the corner of the wall. It was as if he did not care at all what Dongyi would become after his death. For a moment, Fan Xian thought he had misjudged Sigu Jian's intentions before his death. He had once taught him that the most important intentions were intentions. Sigu Jian opened his mouth and said, there is a small booklet under my pillow. Before Ku He died, he gave it to me from Qing Mountain and asked me to give it to you. I don't understand the things in the booklet. I hope you can understand them. Fan Xian was startled. He didn't know what was written on the booklet for the two great grandmasters to take it so seriously before they died. Chapter 672. Fan Xian looked at Sigu Jian. After a moment of silence, he moved closer to the head of the bed. Reaching his hand under the great grandmaster's head, he reached under the pillow. This movement was very slow. The skin on the back of his hand and wrist could clearly feel the wheat husks stuffed into the pillow, as well as the thin, messy, and powerless withered hair scattered on the pillow. His finger touched a hard object. Fan Xian's fingertip gently touched it, and knew it was a small booklet wrapped in rough cloth. Pulling his hand back, he took out the booklet. Fan Xian didn't immediately lift the rough cloth. Instead, he stared in a daze at the booklet, confirming the guess in his heart. This was a relic left behind by Imperial Advisor Ku He. It had been solemnly given to him by Sigu Jian's hand. Presumably, it was a rare treasure. For such a thin booklet, the true value was probably the things recorded in it. Sigu Jian did not rush him. He only calmly and indifferently looked at the corner of the wall. It was as if he was not by his side and had not stretched his hand to the back of his head earlier. In the end, Fan Xian couldn't resist his powerful curiosity. In front of Sigu Jian, he lifted the cloth and saw the contents inside. Different from what he had imagined and what Sigu Jian had said, it was not a small booklet inside. Rather, it was two booklets. Fan Xian shook his head and smiled. Carelessly, he flipped open the booklet on top. Looking at the extremely familiar heart of Tianyi Dao that he could recite backwards, he could not hide his helpless smile. Before Sigu Jian died, he had personally given him pointers on the knowledge of heart and sword intent. Before Ku He died, he had never forgotten to give the heart of Tianyi Dao to Fan Xian. Fan Xian's mouth tasted bitter. It looked like these strange creatures of the older generation were truly a group of strange creatures. They had placed their last hope in resisting the great Qing Emperor on him. Before the great Grandmaster left this world, he wanted to leave behind a sufficiently powerful enemy for the Qing Emperor. Enemies outside of the Qing kingdom were no longer enough to be feared, so this person had to be chosen from within the Qing kingdom. Ku He had his second disciple forcefully extend Chun Pingping's life and set up chess pieces in Shiliang Road. He had calculated that after his death, Fan Xian, this young man, and his cheap father would certainly have some cracks that Northern Qi could use because of what had happened in the past and what was happening now. Sigu Jian gave Dongyi to Fan Xian with both hands, but he also gave Fan Xian a large bag. It was very, very heavy. You guys really think highly of me. Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders. His finger gently tapped the supreme heart that the Qing Mountain faction viewed as a treasure. Or perhaps you are too daring. You have actually placed such an illusory hope on me. Your mother is a person of Dongyi. It is only natural that I place my hopes on you, Sigu Jian said in a raspy voice. However, for Ku He, that damn baldy, to be willing to give you such a large gift is truly beyond my expectations. Fan Xian looked at the heart of Tianyi Dao in a daze. He thought that before Ku He died, he probably still thought that what he had learned from Haidang was an improved version of the heart of Tianyi Dao. He did not know that because Haidang was worried about his injuries, she had disregarded her teacher's orders and passed on the true heart of Tianyi Dao to him. That was in the distant past, far away in Jiangnan. He didn't know what Haidang was doing on the grasslands. Over there, the Huge had already stirred up trouble, and internal strife had begun in Shihu. No matter how talented she was, she would not be of much use far away from the northern Qi border. Before Ku He died, he had given the true heart of Tianyi Dao to Fan Xian in hopes of gathering the power of many people and creating another great grandmaster in this world. Learning too many things is not necessarily a good thing, Fan Xian said. Sigu Jian slanted his eyes and glanced at him. I know you have long learned the things of the Qing Mountain faction. It looks like Ku He has never met you, so he doesn't know this. The booklet he gave you is indeed not very useful. However, this book is still somewhat useful to the disciples of the Sword Hut. Fan Xian looked at him calmly. Of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, only Ku He and Sigu Jian widely accepted disciples. Given Sigu Jian's ability to teach, he had suddenly obtained the secret of Tianyi Dao. How could he not make use of it and pass it on to his disciples? This is for you. Furthermore, it is the trust the damn baldy had in me, Sigu Jian said proudly. I disdained to look at his things. The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. He nodded and said, If I didn't tell you about the 10 family village matter, would you not have given this book to me? Perhaps these words hit the nail on Sigu Jian's head. Sigu Jian had to determine just how loyal Fan Xian was to the Qing Emperor and how much care he might have for Dongyi before he could make up his mind. Handing over Ku He's things was also one of his decisions. This great grandmaster did not admit to this. He only coldly said, "You have learned this book before. What difference does it make if I give it to you or not?" But there's another book below. Fan Xian's gaze gradually calmed. Picking up the second book, he stared at Sigu Jian and asked, "The four great grandmasters have stood side by side for a long time. You disdain to look at Tianyi Dao's martial methods because you are very familiar with Ku He's martial methods. You know that no matter what realm you practice it to, it will be impossible for the sword hut to make a qualitative leap. Are you not curious as to what the small book Ku he solemnly handed to you is placed with the heart of Tianyi Dao?" The small book was even thinner, only about 20 pages. Fan Xian's palm pressed against the book. He looked at Sigu Jian with a smile and waited for his reply. "Of course I'm interested. I never knew that Ku he, that damn baldy, had any other abilities other than those lousy zhenqi he used to plant flowers and trees," Sigu Jian said in a raspy voice. "Earlier, you said what was the use of learning miscellaneous things? Of course, learning miscellaneous things is useful. Even if you don't use it, you can look at it. So you looked at it." Sigu Jian did not deny it. Coldly, he said, "I want to be a postman so I can look at it." After a moment of silence, Sigu Jian closed his eyes slightly and said, "Unfortunately, I don't understand it." As he said this, Fan Xian had already curiously flipped open the small booklet below. He was very interested in what was recorded inside. However, when he flipped open these thin pages, he was disappointed. Something that even Sigu Jian could not understand. Fan Xian could not understand even more. In terms of martial arts realm, comprehension, and spirituality, Fan Xian was far behind this great grandmaster. He looked disappointedly at the strange words on the page and the strange combination of words. He stared fixedly at them, but he could not understand them. Pu rui ma wei na. Pu rei go. Kick de wei sh. The sky above the sword hut had completely darkened. Only the surface of the sea in the distance was still suffused with a deep blue light. After it shone onto the land, the deep blue had already faded to gray. A lot of time had already passed. Fan Xian sighed and put down the small book. He had thought that if he didn't understand the method Ku he left behind, he could consult it with Sigu Jian. After all, for strange creatures like great grandmasters, the death of one was one less. The opportunity to ask Sigu Jian about Ku he's legacy would never come again, at least not in this world. However, he helplessly found that he didn't even have the chance to ask a question. Each word was very strange, and the combination was illogical. The old and young, one sitting and one lying in the room, were both thinking about the last small book Ku he left behind. Sigu Jian suddenly opened his eyes. A glimmer of confusion surged through them. Slowly, he said, 3 years ago, on the summit of the mountain, Ku he once made a hand gesture. The summit of the mountain was the summit of the Great Dong Mountain, the Great Grandmaster Battle. Hearing these words, Fan Xian's heart immediately jumped. He listened carefully. Sigu Jian coughed and sank into silence again. What hand gesture was that? Fan Xian asked with furrowed brows. It should be the magic of the West. It was rare for Sigu Jian to not be confident. In his opinion, in the hearts of all the martial artists in this land, the Western magic and the sorcerers who practiced it were of little value. Given Ku he's realm and strength, how could he spend time practicing such useless things? After hearing these words, Fan Xian was enlightened. His palms slowly came together in front of his chest. A satisfied smile rose to his face. He couldn't help but shake his head. With a smile, he sighed and said, "I know what is written here." "What is it?" "It's a Western script, but it's a direct translation of our script." Fan Xian shrugged. "I used this method when I was about 7. I didn't think that such a powerful figure as Master Ku he would use such a childish method." Of course, what made Fan Xian think of this was not just the familiarity of those strange words, which brought him a sense of familiarity from a Western-style translated novel. It was also not just because he had once trained hard to feed your mother 3 pieces of meat. More importantly, it was because he thought of a novel he had read in his previous life. Sir Jean had written it about the Nining manual. Guijing, that fool, and Wu Li's smearing of that human skin. Sigu Jian furrowed his brows and said, "Western words? Is it really some kind of magic? What kind of use is that?" "Who knows?" Fan Xian felt a headache coming on. Looking at the two little books in his hands, he thought for a moment and then carefully put them into his clothes. "Since Master Ku he left them for me, they should still be of some use." "Don't put your energy into these useless things," Sigu Jian said. He still maintained an innate disdain for the barbaric things of the West. This was probably the natural condescension of an advanced civilization toward an undeveloped one. "It is inclusive and adaptable," Fan Xian replied. "Who knows what benefits I will get after learning it? You can understand these messy words?" For the first time, Sigu Jian furrowed his brows and looked at Fan Xian in surprise. This little book had been in his hands for more than 2 years. Although he had the pride of a great grandmaster and had not peeked at the heart of Tianyi Dao, he had still studied this scribbled book for a long time. He also wanted to know what deep meaning Ku he had in leaving such a thing behind. However, no matter how he studied it, he made no progress. If it was a Western language, Sigu Jian controlled Dongi. The officials and commoners in the city often interacted with foreigners, but he had never heard of any foreigners speaking such a language. Fan Xian smiled and said, "I'll also have to slowly guess. I learned some before, but I've pretty much forgotten it." The words on the booklet that Kui left behind were in Italian. The foreigners that the Qing Kingdom and Dongi had dealings with basically all used a kind of altered Spanish or English. Fan Xian hadn't studied it very carefully. In any case, it was generally like that. Fan Xian had learned Italian. In his previous life, he had taken it as an elective in the second year of university. Was this a coincidence or fate? Everything had been said. The matters that Sigu Jian needed a hand over had already been discussed with Fan Xian. They had already discussed each other in detail. Fan Xian rose from the side of the bed. Just as he was about to leave the room, he suddenly lowered his eyelids slightly and asked seriously, "I still don't understand why you chose me." Yi Qingmei could indeed be considered half a Dongi person, but it was clear that she had put in more effort in the Qing kingdom. Anyone who had seen the yellow-clothed woman frowning at the riverbank would think this. Just because of the so-called household registration, she placed the freedom of Dongi on Fan Xian's body, on this young noble of the Qing kingdom who had once caused Dongi to suffer countless losses. Did she not need a reason? Sigu Jian said, "It is said that a person without hobbies cannot be befriended. I once judged that you have no heart for the world, so you cannot succeed. However, a person without hobbies is nothing more than two kinds. One is a saint, and the other is a fake." "You are a person without hobbies," Sigu Jian continued. Sigu Jian continued, "After Dong Mountain, to me, you suddenly developed a bit of your true nature. However, it has been hidden very deeply. Thus, I think you should be walking the path of the former. Is there someone in this world who does not act for his own personal benefit or the benefit of a country, but only for his own peace of mind?" Sigu Jian looked at him indifferently. "There was one before, and I hope there will be one in the future. If my gamble is wrong, then it's wrong. I don't care. A person who is about to die is always the bravest gambler." Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then walked out of the quiet room and to the side of the sword pit. He saw 13th Wang, silently crying sorrowfully and wiping his tears with his sleeve like a child. The 1,000 swords in the pit were icy cold. Chapter 673. It was already late in the night. Fan Xian stood alone by the sword pit, looking at the densely packed swords in the pit that were like rice and also like the tips of trees piercing into the sky in a daze. He was standing exactly where 13th Wang had been standing earlier. When he was having his final conversation with Sigu Jian in the inner room, he had faintly heard 13th Wang's silent sobbing. The sobbing was silent, but there was still sound. At the time, there was no one else in the depths of the sword hut. Sigu Jian and Fan Xian's discussion was too important. Even the sword boy had been driven far away, leaving only 13th Wang to stand guard outside the room. Fan Xian understood that Sigu Jian was using this to express his attitude. He trusted his last disciple, and Fan Xian also trusted 13th Wang. Dong future depended on the cooperation between 13th Wang and Fan Xian. Sigu Jian wanted 13th Wang to understand more things from this conversation. Fan Xian also hoped that 13th Wang would be able to comprehend something different from the tyrannical martial method he had dictated. This was a silent and tacit mutual reference. However, 13th Wang had sunk into a gloomy mood and could not pull himself out. No one knew how much he had heard or understood. The disciples of the sword hut silently filed into the room. Fan Xian would not go in again. He was not arrogant enough to think that Sigu Jian would actually treat him as the most important and closest young person in the world just because of his mother's relationship in a few meetings. He would be willing to stay with a Qing official before he died. When a great grandmaster was about to die, he would be willing to stay with the 13 disciples he had raised with his own hands. Sigu Jian should be in the room making arrangements for his funeral. Many of these funeral matters were related to Fan Xian or matters that Dong had to cooperate with Fan Xian. It was not convenient for Fan Xian to eavesdrop. He sighed and walked toward the outside of the sword hut. He didn't know if Sigu Jian's final order could suppress Yun Jilan's backlash. Fan Xian had no way to confirm this matter. Walking out of the sword hut, the subordinates of the Overwatch Council and Dong's officials came forward to greet him. They all had different kinds of heavy expressions. Fan Xian shook his head. Accompanied by everyone, he walked toward the mountain residence. What was he waiting for? Waiting for the fall of a master of a generation. Waiting for a great grandmaster to leave this world. Waiting for a meteor to fall from the sky. Fan Xian sat on the chair and rested his chin on his hand as he thought quietly. Around the sword hut, the chirping of insects gradually rose, and the croaking of frogs had already begun. There was a cool breeze and a bright moon. In the distance, the sea breeze was slightly damp and salty, making the shadows of the moon blur. At this moment, he was sitting in the garden near the cliff of the mountain residence. Separated by the stone gate, he looked at the grass hut not far away from his feet. He let the moonlight shine on his body, adding a bit of coldness that did not match the season. The faint light in the depths of the grass hut continued to shine. It was as if it was going to shine forever. Sigu Jian, on his deathbed, should still be giving his final instructions to his disciples. No one knew if there would be any disputes or strange movements in the hut. The 13 disciples of the sword hut worshipped Sigu Jian from the bottom of their hearts. Presumably, no one would dare to betray their teacher. What about Yun Jilan? Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the faint light in the depths of the grass. Suddenly, he raised his head and glanced at the moon. Looking at the moon, drawing a long arc in the sky. Only then did he realize that a number of hours had already passed since he had sat and waited in the mountain residence. The night was already so deep that it could no longer be pulled back. When he turned his head, he saw that in the flower garden halfway up the mountain residence, the wind moved the petals. A shadow followed the angle of the moonlight and quietly came to his side. Fan Xian quietly asked, "Your injury is healed? Why didn't you stay in Jiangnan? Why did you insist on coming back?" The shadow stood in the shadow of the stone gate. His eyes gazed indifferently at the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. "No one knows I've returned." Fan Xian had long been worried that the emperor would develop suspicion and murderous intent toward Qin Pingping because of the shadow's relationship with Sigu Jian. Thus, he had forcefully sent the shadow back to Jiangnan. He had not thought that the shadow would suddenly appear in Dongyi. Without needing to think too much, Fan Xian knew why the shadow had come. He sighed and said, "Do you still hate him?" The shadow was silent for a moment and then said, "Hate." However, when the sword pierced his chest, much of the hatred had already been vented. "There are some things I still don't understand." The shadow looked at the faint light in the grass hut and said, "Even if father was indifferent to him, mother was harsh to him, and everyone in the manor humiliated him. They were, after all, his family. Why did he kill them all? What about me? I was the only person in the manor who saw him as an elder brother. Why did he kill me as well?" Fan Xian gazed at him and said, "You didn't die, did you?" The shadow's body shook slightly. It was clear that his injury had not healed. The injury in his body made his state of mind not as valiant as it was at its peak. He's going to die. Everyone has to die. Fan Xian sat under the stone gate and gently patted the rough stone surface. For your elder brother to be able to live for so long is already inexplicably astonishing. The light in the depths of the grass sword hut was very dim. It was as if it could go out at any moment. The thin and weak Sigu Jian had already sat up from under the blankets. He had washed his face and combed his hair again. A might that no one dared to look directly at rose again on his cold face. The first disciple of the sword hut, Yin Zhilan, held his teacher's arm and helped him sit properly on the bed. 13th Wang brought the water basin outside and poured the dirty water into the Holy Land sword pit. He then returned to the room to help his eldest brother support his teacher. Of the 13 disciples of the sword hut, other than the first disciple and youngest disciple by Sigu Jian's side, the other 11 disciples all knelt in front of the bed with sorrowful expressions. Occasionally, traces of wetness appeared at the corners of some of their eyes. Sigu Jian used a clear and cold gaze to stare at the 3rd and 4th disciples. He did not specifically instruct them on that matter. In a quiet voice, he asked, "Do you remember what I said earlier?" The disciples of the sword hut kowtowed and replied, "We will follow teacher's orders." Just like that, the affairs of Dongyi were settled. Although the disciples of the sword hut had long guessed their teacher's intentions from the movements of these few months, they had not thought that their teacher would place such a large bet on Fan Xian and give him such complete support. Although there was confusion, sorrow, and fear in the hearts of the disciples, no one dared to raise any objections in front of their teacher. Even Yun Zhilan maintained his silence. Sigu Jian spoke more and more slowly. The emotions on his face grew fainter and fainter. He looked more and more like the great grandmaster who had not been injured and did not show his emotions on the outside. Yun Zhilan supported his teacher at the side. His heart was empty. He knew this was the final radiance of a setting sun. A sense of sorrow that was difficult to suppress began to spread through the room. Perhaps 13th Wang had already cried enough earlier, but he was unusually calm now. "What time is it?" Sigu Jian took 2 deep breaths and asked quietly in a raspy voice. "It's almost daybreak," Yun Zhilan replied respectfully and warmly to the side. The passing of Dongyi's last words took up an entire night. No one knew what other plans Sigu Jian had laid down after he sent Dongyi away with both hands. No matter what you do, once you make up your mind to do it, you have to do it to the extreme. Just like in the future of the sword hut, since I have chosen him, you have to help him to the extreme. Since it is a large gamble, you have to put all of your capital into it. Any self-reflection or hesitation is a pain that Dongyi will find difficult to endure. Do you understand? Sigu Jian sat on the bed. His gaze slowly swept across the disciples on the ground and finally landed on Yun Zhilan's face. Yun Zhilan was silent for a long time and then nodded. Sigu Jian gave a rare smile. He understood his eldest disciple too well. As long as he had promised something, he would carry it out. "Help me up the mountain to have a look. The sky is about to brighten. I want to have a look." An inauspicious croaking suddenly rang out from Sigu Jian's chest. It sounded like the sound of a netherworld spring calling for water under the yellow earth. The great grandmaster's face also began to show a strange whiteness. Yin Zhilan's heart ached. He held tightly to his teacher's withered arm. On the other side, 13th Wang also held Sigu Jian's other arm. The 2 disciples met each other's eyes and carefully helped Sigu Jian down from the bed. The second disciple of the sword hut, kneeling at the very front of the bed, moved forward on his knees. Using the fastest speed, he held Sigu Jian's feet and helped him put on his tattered straw sandals. However, Sigu Jian had been bedridden for more than a month. The poison and injuries had all broken out. His feet had long swollen. Putting on the straw sandals, it was possible to see the swollen areas where the straps of the straw sandals had tightened the swollen areas into lumps. Sigu Jian didn't seem to feel anything. He only let out a comfortable sigh. The second disciple knew that his teacher's feet were already numb. He gently stroked his feet, and his tears fell onto the stone floor in front of the bed. The moon was like a hook, gradually disappearing into the slightly gray horizon. Most of the sky above Dongi was still pitch black and deep blue. Only the eastern side showed the white of a fish belly. Fan Xian, who had sat by the stone door for an entire night, felt tired. He rubbed his temples and told himself not to fall asleep. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and abruptly rose. He watched as the light in the depths of the grass hut suddenly went out. He knew that Dongi's funeral arrangements had been made. Immediately after, he saw a scene that would be deeply engraved in his heart for many years to come. In the distance, the thin and short Sigu Jian walked out of the grass hut with the support of Yin Zhilan and 13th Wang and the protection of all the disciples of the sword hut. Following the path of the grass hut, he walked with great difficulty, silence, and even solemnity toward the mountain behind the sword hut. The shadow stood behind Fan Xian and also saw this scene. He was silent and didn't speak. Faintly, he seemed to be able to see Sigu Jian, at the end of his life, glance back as he was being supported up the mountain by his disciples. That glance landed on the stone door of the mountain residence. It was unknown whether he was looking at Fan Xian, who held Dongi's future in his hands, or his younger brother, the Shadow, who represented Dongi's childhood memories. Fan Xian and the Shadow stood silently at the mountain door and watched as the group advanced toward the top of the mountain. The two of them stood ramrod straight, perhaps to express their respect for this great grandmaster. They had a stand to send him off. Their eyes were level, and there was no other emotion mixed in. The great grandmaster's body was thin and short. With Yun Zhilan and 13th Wang's support, he was almost invisible. The hemp clothing on his body floated in the morning wind. His feet, wearing straw sandals, did not touch the ground at all. The mountain behind the grass hut was not tall. It was an entire mountain from where Fan Xian and the Shadow were. It was not far. In a moment, the people of the sword hut had climbed to the top of the mountain. The rising sun on the eastern sea leaped out of the serene coastline and climbed up. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and watched as the first ray of light in the world passed through the surface of the sea, the private residences in Dongi, the aura of the mortal world, and the gaps in the trees. It shone on the small mountain behind the grass hut, on the bodies of the disciples of the Dongi sword hut, and on the face of the thin great grandmaster at the very front. A faint golden light immediately rose to the great grandmaster's face. Although he was at the end of his life and his body was weak and small, he suddenly towered above all life. This was not the aura of sword intent. It was the feeling of this person's existence. Fan Xian glanced toward the top of the mountain. Among the crowd, he was the only one he could see. Sigu Jian stood calmly by the edge of the cliff and allowed the warm and familiar sunlight to hit him from the other side of the sea. He narrowed his eyes slightly and sniffed the air of Dongi and the aura of this place. He was silent and didn't say a word. No one knew what he was thinking. No one knew if, in the moment of his death, the history of the past and everything in the past had become a number of images in the great grandmaster's mind. Following the golden light of the rising sun, they changed endlessly in front of his eyes. The ants under the tree, the friend covered in black cloth, his brother, the rain, the dead man, the burning of the manor, the sword pit, the tattered cloth and trash in the pit, his disciple, and more disciples. Another sword, a large sword, a heavenly sword. One sword swept across the world. One sword protected the mighty city. The city was not broken. The sword was not broken. Sigu Jian blinked his listless eyes and cleanly dispelled the illusion of the rising sun. He tried his best to stand higher and see further. He wanted to see what was real. However, his legs had no strength. His gaze was also blurry. Yin Zhilan and 13th Wang sensed their teacher's thoughts and quickly helped him up. Sigu Jian suddenly felt his gaze become clear. He saw the Dongi he had protected for decades. He saw the smoke rising from the chimneys in the city. He saw the busy merchants setting up the morning market. He saw the wealth flowing through the city's marketplace. He saw the people's happy smiles. In the moment of his death, he suddenly felt that he didn't want to see these things. He turned his head slightly and saw the grass hut he had lived in for many years. Many years ago, it was actually just a broken grass hut. He had lived there for a long time, killed many people, and taught many people. He was very proud. Finally, Sigurd saw the large tree outside Dongi. Under the rising sun, this large tree, which had experienced countless storms on the East Sea, still grew healthily and wildly. It protected the people, travelers, merchants, and commoners who passed by under the tree. Chapter 674. The morning sun rose from the east and shone on the hill behind the hut. The slightly warm morning light did not have any trace of twilight as it enveloped the summit of the mountain. The dozen or so teachers and disciples of the sword hut stood in the warm light facing the sun. It looked like an oil painting. At the foot of the hill, the third-generation disciples of the sword hut, sword boys, servants who had served Sigurd for countless years, and officials looked at this scene. They knew that the Grandmaster of Dongi had reached his last moment. Countless people found it difficult to hide their sorrow. They knelt on the ground and kowtowed endlessly toward the direction of the hill. In the mountain residence at the waist of the mountain, Fan Xian and the Shadow watched. Although their expressions did not change, their hearts were moved. Fan Xian suddenly felt that his emotions were strange. After all these years, his relationship with Dongi had always been complicated, particularly towards Sigurd, the great Grandmaster. He actually did not have any deep understanding of him. He only knew that he was an extraordinary warrior and a powerful person who could use a sword in his hand to change the situation of the world. For many years, Sigurd had been his greatest enemy. Yet with the passing of time, the relationship between people had undergone such a great change. Even last night, Fan Xian did not have any extra feelings towards Sigurd. His negotiations with Sigurd were only a cooperation between the two sides based on a certain goal of mutual benefit. Fan Xian truly could not feel too much emotion toward a great grandmaster who had caused the deaths of many of his subordinates and Qing people. The sunlight had come. The sunlight came. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh bitterly at himself. Looking at the thin and weak figure at the top of the mountain, he wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had actually seen this great grandmaster as a revolutionary who protected the world and loved the people. The Shadow stood a step outside the mountain gate and looked calmly and dazedly at Sigurd on the summit of the mountain. He watched his brother, whose life was tangled with and injured, take his last few breaths in the world. After Fan Xian retreated back into the shadows of the mountain gate, he fell silent. For some reason, the blood in his heart surged slightly. The two different types of Jinqi in his body slowly began to circulate, particularly the powerful tyrannical Jinqi at the back of his waist. It was released along his two arms and circled around the edges of his palms, forming a very round Jinqi circuit. It was only half an inch away from his palms, but it was a very sensitive release of Jinqi. He sensed something, and looked to the east, all the way to the boundless sea over there, to the waves that were breathing under the red morning sun. On the summit, Sigurd gaze also landed on the waves. A gust of wind came from afar, carrying with it some wet raindrops. Above the rising sun in the sky, there was a thick layer of dark clouds. The wind and rain came, as if to send him off, as if to baptize him. Other than Fan Xian and the dying Sigurd, no one sensed the aura purposely released by that person. Fan Xian quietly left the mountain residence and left behind the people kneeling on the ground in worship around the sword hut. He swept diagonally into Dongi, raising his speed to the fastest level. In a short time, he had stepped over private residences and businesses, passed by the ships in the harbor, and arrived outside of Dongi, on a secluded beach near the shore of the East Sea. The raindrops by the shore were already falling densely, hitting the beach and creating tens of thousands of holes. A gray shadow swept past and then stopped valiantly on a rock by the beach. It was Fan Xian. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the small holes the raindrops had made on the beach. Suddenly, He thought of the marks left on the beach when he saw half a small boat sink under the cliff in Danjo many years ago. The wind and rain did not grow stronger. They only blew gently and coldly as they fell. The morning sun rose higher. After rising into the rain clouds, the light in all of Dongyi grew dim, particularly on the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks and stirred up endless mist. Mixing with the wind and drizzle falling from the sky, it added a sense of haziness. Behind the mist, the figure of a giant ship slowly appeared. The body of the ship was enormous. It was an ocean-going merchant ship that could withstand tens of thousands of li of ocean waves. The ship was unable to get close to the shoreline, covered in rocks. It only appeared in the distant ocean. Although it was far away, the inexplicable sense of pressure still made Fan Xian feel a glimmer of nervousness. The sea suddenly calmed down at this moment. Although the wind and rain continued, the raindrops fell silently into the sea, fell silently into the sand, and moistened the world silently. The waves no longer violently crashed against the shore, but slowly rose and fell, as if this continent was breathing. A small boat came faintly through the white mist. Fan Xian took a deep breath. He then stepped onto the slightly wet and soft sand and walked toward the seaside to welcome the arrival of the small boat. A person stood at the bow of the small boat with his hands behind his back. His slightly white hair was tied behind his head with a strip of cloth. His face was strange, and his eyes were clear and unfathomable. He wore a straw hat on his head. Although the hat was small, it stopped the gentle and dense wind and rain from approaching the small boat. There was a person sitting at the bow of the boat. He also wore a straw hat, but the brim of the hat did not hide his different colored hair or the strange and terrifying smile at the corners of his lips. Yi Luyan had come. When Siga Jian was about to die, he had finally come to see him off. Fan Xian felt slightly shocked. He then looked at the person sitting at the end of the boat and smiled warmly. Sir Fei Jie had also come. At a time when he was about to be exhausted, being able to see someone close to him actually diluted the shock Yi Luyun's sudden appearance brought. The small boat neared the seaside. Yi Luyun stood quietly at the bow of the boat. His gaze passed through the green trees and hills by the seaside and cast into the distance. Siga Jian was probably on the hill in that direction, looking wretchedly and coldly at the seaside. Fan Xian stood in the wind and rain and wiped away the rain on his face. Looking at the silent and silent Yi Luyun, his thin lips opened slightly. In the end, he didn't say anything. The sound of water gradually rose. Fei Jie jumped down from the back of the boat and walked toward the shore in the shallow water. Fan Xian quickly went forward and helped his teacher onto the shore. The teacher and disciple met each other's eyes. Their gazes were both warm and gratified. Fan Xian didn't talk about the problems in Jingdo, Tin Family Village, or Qinpingping. He knew that traveling abroad was Fei Jie's lifelong wish. This great grandmaster of poisons liked freedom. If it weren't for Fan Xian, he would probably have long left the Qin kingdom. Since Qinpingping had tricked him away, Fan Xian would continue tricking him. These 2 years we've wandered around the islands in the Southern Ocean. Fei Jie looked at his proudest disciple and said with a smile. Fei Jie looked at his proudest disciple and said with a smile, I've already decided to set sail this year and travel to the west. The Western Ocean is very far. Fan Xian glanced at Yi Luyun standing woodenly at the bow of the boat. Ignoring the great grandmaster, he held his teacher's hand and walked a little further. Worriedly, he said, Given your temper, I'm afraid you'll have to go deep into the Western Ocean. How many years will it take to go back and forth? Fei Jie looked at him with a smile and said, Given my and Master Ye's age, I'm afraid we won't be able to come back once we go. Fan Xian's throat seemed to be blocked by something. He had thought he would never see his teacher again. Unexpectedly, when he saw him today, it would be an eternal farewell. After a moment of sadness, he forced a smile and pointed at the sea. With a ship like this, we can go anywhere in the world. Fei Jie turned his head and looked at the indistinct figure of the ship behind the mist. With a laugh, he said, I bought a lot of foreign servants and some foreign girls. They are very different from us women. If you look, you'll definitely like them. I've spent some time with my Sasa, Fan Xian replied with a smile. Why are you here today? Fei Jie had wanted to ask this question earlier. He turned his head to look at Yi Luyun, who was standing at the bow of the boat and had not come ashore. After a moment of silence, he said he seemed to have sensed something and knew that Sigu Jian was about to die, so he wanted to send him on his way. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and glanced at Yi Luyun, who was standing like a statue in the rain. Using a complicated emotion, he smiled gently and said, Wasn't Sigu Jian killed by him and the emperor? Fei Jie shook his head and didn't say anything. Fan Xian also stopped this topic. Looking at Yi Luyun's figure, he also shook his head along with his teacher. Yi Luyun stood silently at the front of the little boat and looked silently in the direction of Dongyi. The straw hat on his head seemed to have lost its effect. It allowed the wind and rain to strike his body and then slide into the boat, leaving him wet. After a long time, this great grandmaster suddenly lowered his head in thought for a moment. He then waved his hand at Fan Xian. Fan Xian was slightly startled, but his expression did not change at all. Calmly, he walked over and stood in the knee-deep water. Looking at the little boat, not 5 steps away, he respectfully greeted him. I'm leaving. Yi Luyun looked at Fan Xian warmly. I might never come back again. Do you have anything you want to ask me? Of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, Fan Xian had never seen Ku He. He only knew of the Northern Qi Imperial Advisor's power from Haitang, Northern Qi's arrangements after the incident, and Shao En's memories. As for Sigu Jian, he had personally experienced his shocking sword intent and clearly knew his battle lines. As for the Emperor, Fan Xian knew in his bones that he was incomparably powerful. Only Yi Luyun, whom Fan Xian had seen in his youth, had also seen in Jiangnan. That stunning strike of a sword that could topple a building made him, for the first time, have a complete understanding of the great Grandmaster realm. Furthermore, there was a fundamental difference between Yi Luyun and the other 3 great Grandmasters. He was like a leisurely cloud. For his entire life, he floated on the land, temporarily stayed, and then left again. He was like a speck of light without strings holding it, incomparably free and at ease. Because of this, Fan Xian had always admired and respected Yi Luyun the most. First, it was the Juanshan Conference and then Dong Mountain. Fan Xian finally understood that in this world, there would never be a person who was above the common people. If there was, it could only be Uncle Wu Zhu and not the great grandmaster on the boat. Fan Xian knew why Yi Luyun had spoken at this time. After a moment of silence, he didn't ask for any questions about martial arts. Instead, he asked straightforwardly, Why have you come? In the rain, Yi Luyun raised his head slightly. The entire strange face appeared from under the straw hat. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would use such a precious opportunity to ask such an unexpected question. After a moment of silence, Yi Luyun said, I have come to send you off. Why are you leaving? Fan Xian asked again. Because I like it, Yi Luyun replied with a slight smile. Then, why did you attack in the beginning? Fan Xian asked in the end. Because I'm a Qing person, Yi Luyun replied seriously. Fan Xian thought about this question for a long time. A Qing person. He was also a Qing person. In this world, belonging could truly determine the motivation of all actions. Even a great grandmaster was no exception. Fan Xian took a deep breath and smiled. I don't have any other questions. I'm just curious. Will you come back in the future? Who knows what will happen in the future? Fan Xian shook his head and didn't say anything more. Given Yi Luyun and Sir Fei Jie's realm, although it was the distant and mysterious Western continent, there was probably nothing that could hold them back or harm them. Fan Xian didn't have any questions to ask, but Yi Luyun seemed to have something to say. He looked at Fan Xian and smiled warmly. After the Wei Kingdom, the world was in chaos. Wars broke out everywhere. The common people lost their homes and suffered unspeakably. I helped your father sweep away the last obstacle. The things in the future will be for you young people to do. Yi Luyun, as a great grandmaster, had endured silently for 20 years and secretly cooperated with the emperor's plan to sweep away all the hidden dangers within the Qing kingdom in one fell swoop. He removed the two biggest obstacles to unifying the world, Ku He and Sigurjian. There was no point in Yi Luyun staying on this land any longer. Thus, before he left, he came to take one more look and say these words to Fan Xian. In this great grandmaster's eyes, Fan Xian was, without question, the most outstanding warrior of the younger generation. It was not just his martial cultivation, but also his ability to scheme and his daily attention to the common people. That was why Yi Luyun had sent these words to him. However, Yi Luyun did not know Fan Xian's heart. For a great grandmaster to see through a person's heart was an impossible task. After saying this, Yi Luyun said no more to Fan Xian. He continued to stand at the bow of the boat, looking at the mountaintop and the person on the distant mountaintop who was about to die. Perhaps it was a friend. Fan Xian lowered his head in silence for a moment. He then walked back to shore and spoke in a low voice with Mr. Fei Jia. They were about to say goodbye. He and his teacher had many things he wanted to say. Even if it was just some trivial childhood memories, there were not many opportunities to reminisce. Fan Xian took out the booklet Ku he left him and handed it to Mr. Fei Jia. The thing Ku he left behind should have something to do with magic. Find someone in the West and ask. Just read it out. Those people should be able to understand. It's probably something to do with Italy, Rome, or something. Seeing how serious he was and how he said it was something Ku he left behind, Mr. Fei Jia furrowed his brows. He accepted it and put it in his clothes. In a raspy voice, he said, "Don't worry. No one can steal this from my hands." Fan Xian's eyes were sharp. He had long seen that Mr. Fei Jia had done something to the booklet. He smiled and said, "If those thieves are not afraid of death, since it's something Ku he left for you, presumably it has some use. Why didn't you keep it for yourself? I memorized it last night." Fan Xian pointed at his head and smiled as he reminded his teacher of the strange memory he had had since he was young. Fei Jia smiled and thought of the days and nights when he was teaching this strange creature in Danzhou many years ago. The wind and rain by the east sea gradually lessened. Fan Xian and Fei Jia sensed something at the same time and stopped chatting. Turning their heads to look at the little boat gently rising and falling with the waves, they looked at Yi Luyun at the bow of the boat. The smile on Yi Luyun's face grew warmer and warmer, more and more free. It was as if he had seen through something and had a free and easy feeling. A wave came crashing over. The little boat shook slightly. Yi Luyun used the momentum to lower his body and bowed deeply toward a grass hut on a small mountain in the direction of Dongyi. Fan Xian's heart sank. He knew that person had gone. Fei Jia watched this scene silently and said, "I'm leaving." The long-legged mosquito in the grass hut finally could not stand the torment of time. Seeing that the weather was about to get hot, the happiest time of life, it could no longer stand in the corner of the wall. It stared hopelessly at the thick blankets and the empty space in the blankets. Dispiritedly, it fell from the wall and landed on the ground. Blown by the wind that leaked in through the crack in the door, it went somewhere. On the small mountain behind the grass hut, the thin and weak figure was already lying in the arms of his disciples. There was no longer any sign of life. The little boat by the seaside slowly left and headed toward the large ship in the mist. Fan Xian stood on the beach and bowed deeply as a farewell. Until the end, Yi Luyun still did not abandon the boat and go ashore. Perhaps this great grandmaster had set a limit in his heart. He did not want to set foot on this land filled with killing and helplessness for the rest of his life, because he did not know if he would be willing to leave once he set foot on this land. This was the freedom and determination of being able to abandon. Fan Xian watched the little boat gradually disappear into the wind and rain. He thought to himself, this is what it means to leave the little boat and leave the rest of one's life in the Jianghai. Some people can leave, but even more people can't. When can I go to the free Jianghai, covered in wind and rain? I came from the sea and lived in seclusion in this desert. The desert and the sea actually have the same meaning. Coming from the sea means going to the sea. Writing this here is a breakpoint. The meaning it wants to express has been expressed clearly. It does not only mean that Sigu Jian lived by the seaside, died by the seaside, came from the sea, and pointed his sword at the world. It also does not mean that Yi Luyan came from the sea to send him off, and then went to the sea with Fei Jie. The main purpose is to create that kind of atmosphere and highlight Fan Xian's helplessness. Many people say that Fan Xian hasn't been happy in a long time. Using the words written by Jiang Yicao 4 years ago is already like this. How can one still laugh? You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.